Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. This happened last summer, and it's probably the weirdest and scariest experience I've ever had. It was one of those warm New England summer nights, and my friend, Chris, not his real name, was sleeping over at my house. Chris and I are both night owls, so whenever we hang out, we usually stay up pretty late. It was around 2 a.m., and we were bored, trying to come up with something to do. Since we're both into the outdoors, I suggested we go for a quick night hike near my house. We grabbed a few firecrackers to mess around with and planned to play some music. In hindsight, not the smartest idea, but it seemed fun at the time. I live on a rural dirt road, surrounded by woods, so there are plenty of trails nearby. When we got there, the trail was unexpectedly muddy, and I ended up dropping my flashlight, which broke it. We thought about turning back, but instead we just used our phone flashlights. I had been to this spot before and knew of a pond with a small dock further along the trail. It was a nice little spot to hang out, so we decided to keep going. It took about 20 minutes to hike to the dock. When we arrived, we were greeted by a chorus of frogs croaking loudly, which immediately put us on edge, but we stayed. We lit off a few small firecrackers, the kind that make a loud pop, but no real flames, and started playing some music from a speaker. Everything was fine until Chris told me to turn down the music because he thought he heard something. I lowered the volume, and that's when we heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It sounded like an ATV or some other small vehicle. Now, it's not unusual to hear ATVs or off-road vehicles on these trails, but what threw us off was the time. It was around 2:30 in the morning. Who in their right mind would be out riding at that hour? Chris and I exchanged nervous glances. The sound was getting closer, and something felt off. We quickly packed up our stuff, not really sure what was about to happen. The vehicle was heading straight for us, and we didn't know what else to do. So we hid in a nearby ditch, crouching behind some bushes. The vehicle stopped just before the opening to the dock. It idled there for what felt like an eternity, but it was probably about 5 minutes. The strange part, they had their headlights off. We could only make out the faint glow of what seemed like a small flashlight, like whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They were trying to navigate without drawing attention to themselves, which sent our fear levels through the roof. Why would anyone with good intentions want to hide their location like that? Our hearts were racing, and we could barely breathe. After what felt like forever, the vehicle slowly drove off in another direction. The moment we thought they were far enough away, we bolted. We didn't even bother using our phone flashlights. I was so freaked out I just used my phone's screen light to guide us. On our way back, we saw fresh exhaust, smoke lingering in the air, and tire tracks on the trail. It hit us that they must have seen our car parked at the trailhead and knew someone was there. That realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Luckily, we made it back to the car without any issues, but the drive home was silent except for Chris saying, "That felt like pure survival." He wasn't wrong. That's exactly how it felt. I've thought about that night a lot since it happened, trying to make sense of it. One theory I came up with is that maybe someone was out late cruising on their ATV and saw our car. Maybe they thought we were lost or needed help, but that doesn't explain why they went out of their way to hide their location. The whole no headlights thing was bizarre, and it's still weird to think someone would be out there at that hour, driving like that. If anyone has any ideas or can explain what might have been going on, I'd love to hear them. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and the creepy feeling of being hunted will stick with me forever. A few years ago, some good friends and I decided to take a break from work and spend time in the outdoors. We're all pretty active and wanted a little time to relax before our next big assignment. Cape, one of my friends, found a cabin for us up in the mountains. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a cabin right by a lake, surrounded by nature. From the pictures, it looked peaceful and ideal. Cape, an outdoor enthusiast, had an RV, so we all met at his place to load up and hit the road. Mary, the only woman in our group, joined us, and she's always been popular with everyone. We brought some drinks, packed our bags, and started the long drive. Mary estimated it would take the better part of a day to get there. We listened to rock music, took occasional shots, and started unwinding. Even before we arrived out by the time night fell, we had finally reached the cabin. Just as it appeared in the pictures, the cabin was nestled beside a serene lake with no signs of civilization around us. The view of the lake under the full moon was breathtaking. There wasn't any electricity, but there were plenty of lanterns, so it didn't seem like a big deal. As we unloaded our gear, Mary called us over to check something out. Near the side of the cabin, there were several freshly dug troughs in the ground, and strange runes were carved into the earth beside them. It was weird, but we were all exhausted and didn't think too much of it. We each had our own rooms, and everyone was ready to crash after the long trip. While the others headed to bed, I stayed up for a while, sitting on the porch to take in the stars. I was struggling to stay awake when suddenly I heard a voice. It was faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice calling for help. She sounded like she was in pain. All of my tiredness vanished in an instant. I went inside, grabbed my pistol, and stepped back out. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence, except for the gentle splash of the lake against the shore. Then I heard the voice again, this time coming from the direction of the RV. "Help me, please." It sounded even more desperate now. I flicked on my flashlight and cautiously walked toward the RV. The voice was getting closer, but something felt off. There was the sound of rustling from the bushes beside the cabin. Suddenly, a large figure rushed at me from the darkness near the RV. My flashlight flickered, but I saw enough to know I was in trouble. I fired a few rounds in the direction of the figure. Cape was the first out, followed by Mary and the others. Some of them had grabbed their guns. I explained what had just happened, and they listened closely, their faces filled with concern. Cape, furious, stormed toward his RV to check things out. The clouds had covered the moon by this point, and it was pitch black. He cursed loudly, telling whoever or whatever was out there to leave if they knew what was good for them. After inspecting the area, we decided to set up a watch rotation for the night. Cecil and Alex volunteered to stay up until morning. At first light, we stepped outside again. There were scratch marks on the back of the RV, and Cape was livid. We also found large footprints leading into the woods, along with some dried blood near where I had shot the creature. While we were discussing what to do next, we heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. A police car pulled up, and a tall, skinny officer stepped out. His hair was long and stringy, and as we got closer, I noticed that he smelled terrible. "So what's going on here?" the officer asked. We didn't respond right away. He then said, "We received a call about some suspicious activity." Cape chuckled, not buying the officer's story. "There's no one within 25 miles of this place. Kappa said, his expression hardening. "What's your name and badge number?" The officer didn't answer. That's when Mary chimed in. "You smell like you haven't bathed in weeks. What's your deal?" "Well, false alarm," the officer muttered, trying to make his exit. He turned to get back in his car, but Kappa wasn't having it. "I asked you a question," he said, blocking the officer's way. We started surrounding the officer, and Kappa peeked into the police car. There was no radio, no equipment. "What the hell is this?" Kappa growled. "Get out of here, you freak." The officer scrambled into his car and sped off. Kappa nodded to me and Mary. "Follow him. You know what to do." Kappa had a couple of dirt bikes strapped to the back of his RV, and Mary and I quickly unhooked them. We took off after the car, which was already heading down the road. I pulled up beside the passenger window and swung a chain at the windshield. It cracked with a loud thud. The driver panicked and swerved into a ditch, flipping the car as it crashed into the trees. We pulled up next to the wreck. The door creaked open, and the fake cop crawled out, bleeding from a gash on his head. "Stop right there," Mary ordered, but he kept trying to free himself from the wreckage. "We know you're not a cop," I said. "Now tell us, who made the call?" Mary grabbed him by his hair and yanked hard. "You're a liar," she hissed, pulling out a chunk of his greasy hair as he screamed. "Who called?" What was supposed to be a relaxing vacation had turned into something out of a nightmare. The next morning, we packed up and left. Kappa planned to call the person who rented us the cabin and give them an earful. That cabin and the weird ruins, we were sure we had stumbled into something we were never meant to see. I was 15 when this happened. Being deaf, I rely on sign language and my ability to speak to communicate. But that day, my senses were tuned into something beyond what I could explain. My aunt's house was next to an old, abandoned two-story house with a basement. The fence between the properties was torn and mostly buried in the ground, making it easy for me and my 12-year-old cousin to slip through. My aunt's land stretched all the way to the woods, so we had plenty of space to explore, and that abandoned house always intrigued us. One day, we decided to check it out as the back door was missing. We crept into the living room where old furniture sat, and touched, like whoever had lived there left everything behind. My cousin, being younger, started to feel uneasy because it was dark inside, but I was determined to explore the place. We moved carefully through the house, climbing the stairs by testing each step with a heavy rock to make sure it was safe. When we finally made it to the top, we found an empty hallway with 3 rooms and a bathroom. I held my cousin's hand as we entered the first room. It was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. The window had no dust on it, and the whole room felt new, which was unsettling in such an old house. We moved to the second room, which was the complete opposite, dirty, with rotting walls. In the center was a bed covered in leaves, dark brown stains, and a frame that looked ready to collapse. Then we reached the third room. Just standing in the doorway, I felt sick to my stomach, like someone was watching us. My cousin suddenly complained about a rotting smell that hadn't been there before. I turned to look down the hall, and that's when I saw a black, transparent figure in a wheelchair sitting in the first room we had explored. It was just staring at us. My cousin froze, but I quickly signed to him, telling him that someone was watching us from the end of the hall. That's when I heard a voice in my head say, "Under the cross." I was terrified. I grabbed my cousin, and we bolted out of the house, running back through the broken fence. As we reached the yard, we spotted a fresh-looking cross stuck in the ground near the back entrance of the house. My cousin, being germophobic, always made us wear gloves during our adventures, and I was grateful for that now. With the gloves on, I felt brave enough to pick up the cross, confused by what the voice had meant. After examining it for a moment, I put it back in the ground. We rushed to my aunt's porch, where my family was gathered, and told them everything that had happened. My uncle, a big, kind man who knew the land like the back of his hand, grabbed a shovel and decided to check out the cross for himself. He dug at the spot where the cross was and uncovered a small cardboard box. When he opened it, we found the body of a deceased cat wrapped in a beautiful pink blanket, the same fabric we had seen on the bed upstairs in the house. There was a note, plastic flowers, and a spell jar surrounding the cat. My uncle, always respectful of life, fetched a wooden box from the shed, cleaned it, and gently placed the cat and the items inside. He read the note, which revealed the cat's name, Snow, a 16-year-old cat with white fur. My uncle then reburied Snow in the box and used a tool to carve her name into the cross. Later, my uncle spoke to a neighbor who told him that Snow had been hanging around that house ever since it was abandoned. What was strange was that no one in the neighborhood had buried the cat. The cross had just appeared out of nowhere. To this day, I'm 19 now, and we still occasionally see a ghostly white cat roaming the property. The house was torn down a few years after this incident, but my cousins say they still see shadowy figures, and that same wheelchair in the woods near where the house once stood. You might not believe what happened to me yesterday. I am still trying to make sense of it. I visit my mom every few months. Since I live abroad now, I'm in Paris, and she's in Belgium. Whenever I visit, we have this little tradition. She always waves at me from her window when I leave, even if I'm just stepping out for a few hours. We've been doing this for 17 years, ever since she moved there when I was 14. But this last visit was different. It left me feeling uneasy. After saying our goodbyes, I was walking down the path that leads to the bus stop, like always. When I turned around to see her wave from the window, I saw her standing there like she usually does. She was smiling, holding the curtain with one hand and waving with the other. It was such a familiar moment, and I waved back, smiling. She waved again, but just a few seconds later, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She asked if I had reached the bus stop because she hadn't seen me pass by on the street. She mentioned that she had gone to the window, but I was already gone. That's when it hit me she hadn't been at the window when I waved. She insisted she never saw me leave the building. I know what I saw. I'm absolutely certain. No one else was in the apartment. It was just her and me. My mom lives alone, and there's no way someone could have entered her flat unnoticed. Her place is on the 3rd floor, so even from a distance, I could clearly see her face, her smile, and her wave. There's one more strange detail. What kept her from going to the window was hearing me talking to a neighbor in the staircase as I was leaving. She opened her door to tell me the bus was coming soon, but she didn't find me or any neighbor. I didn't talk to anyone in the staircase. I walked out without meeting anyone at all. I've had strange experiences before, but this was different. I can't shake the feeling that something odd happened, something beyond explanation. I didn't feel weird yesterday, and I hadn't been drinking or taking anything that might have altered my perception. Everything felt completely normal until that moment. So now I'm asking Reddit, what do you think happened? What could I have seen? Has anyone else experienced something similar? Because I just can't figure out who or what was waving at me from my mom's window. About a year ago, I decided to organize a night out with my closest friends, four of us in total. It was the usual crew: me, Tom, Connor, and Jake. We planned to meet at my place, and from there, we'd walk to dinner. The restaurant wasn't far, just about 5 kilometers away, and the weather was mild enough for a nighttime stroll, typical for Australia during the cooler months. Nights tend to get a bit chilly, but nothing we weren't used to. Our route led us through mostly suburban neighborhoods, the kind of middle-class area where crime is a rare occurrence, save for the occasional break-in. The streets were quiet that night, and the sound of our casual banter filled the air as we walked. After about 3 kilometers, we reached a familiar shortcut that cuts straight through the Australian bush. This path wasn't well maintained, but it was the quickest way to the shopping center where our restaurant was located. Even during the day, the shortcut is a bit eerie. It's an old concrete path running through the remnants of a dried-out creek, with large hills on either side that seem to close in around you. The thick canopy above blocks out most of the light, and as dusk gave way to full darkness, it quickly became pitch black around us. I took out my phone and switched on the flashlight, mainly to keep an eye out for snakes. This was Australia, after all, and running into something slithery wouldn't have been out of the ordinary. The path had a steep drop in the middle, something we all remembered fondly from our childhood days, when we'd ride our bikes down the hill for a thrill. Back then, the path had been better taken care of, but now it was mostly cracked and overgrown, which only added to the sense of isolation as we ventured deeper into the bush. As we reached the steepest part of the path, I couldn't resist messing around. I gave Tom a playful shove, pushing him into Connor, and the two stumbled into each other laughing. The next thing I knew, I had slipped in the loose dirt and went down hard, my blue Adidas cap flying off my head. It was a cheap knockoff, but still it had been one of my favorites. We spent a minute or two searching for it in the dim light of my phone, but it seemed to have disappeared into the dense underbrush. "Guess the bush has claimed it," I said, half joking, as I dusted myself off. With the cap lost to the wilderness, we pressed on toward the restaurant. None of us were bothered by the fall. It was just one of those goofy moments you laugh off later. Dinner was uneventful. We didn't drink that night, just enjoy some good food, laughed over old stories, and plan what to do next weekend. By the time we finished, it was well past 10, and we started the walk back, this time without the excitement of taking the shortcut. As we walked past the entrance to the bush trail, on the way home, I felt a strange tug of curiosity, but I ignored it. Maybe it was just the eeriness of walking past such a dark, silent path at night. We talked about plans for the future, upcoming holidays, and how we'd need to do this more often. What I didn't know at the time was that the night was far from over. Later that week, I went back to the bush path alone. I figured I'd try to retrieve my cap, and, besides, there was something about that night that lingered with me. The thought of losing something, even something as small and cheap as that knockoff cap, gnawed at me more than it should have. As I retraced our steps, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the bush was. Even the birds and insects seemed to have fallen silent. I reached the steep part of the path where I had fallen and started looking around, hoping to spot the blue cap among the red dirt. As I crouched down near the spot where I'd hit the ground, a faint rustling sound echoed through the trees. I assumed it was just an animal, maybe a wallaby or even a possum, but as I stood up and looked around, there was no movement, no sign of any life in the bush at all. Just the cold, unsettling feeling of being watched. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I walked a little further, scanning the bushes, but still no sign of my cap. Annoyed, I was about to give up when something caught my eye. There, half buried under a cluster of dry leaves, was a flash of blue fabric. I reached down, but as I pulled the cap from the dirt, I realized something wasn't right. The cap was damp, almost wet, as if it had been left out in the rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. I felt a sudden chill crawl down my spine, and in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I heard the rustling again, louder this time, and much closer. I turned sharply, shining my phone's light into the dark trees. At first I saw nothing, just the dense undergrowth and the thick trunks of the trees. But then, deeper into the bush, I saw a movement, a shadow. Something tall and thin, darting between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my eyes locked on the spot where the figure had disappeared. I heard the rustling again, this time moving away from me, deeper into the bush. Without waiting to see what it was, I turned and bolted back up the path, my cap forgotten in my hand. By the time I reached the top of the hill, I was out of breath, my mind racing. I glanced back once, expecting to see the shadow again, but the path behind me was empty, as if whatever had been there was content to let me leave. I've never taken that shortcut since. Even when I walk past it now, something about that path feels wrong. I've told the guys about what happened, but they just laugh it off, telling me I probably scared myself over nothing. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in those woods that night. I worked in the truck stop industry for about 15 years, and I've seen some strange things. This particular location, though, was something else entirely. In less than 18 months of working there, I experienced enough bizarre events to last a lifetime. If people are interested, I have other stories from different locations, but this one had the most frequent occurrences of weirdness. I was offered a promotion and a fat raise to help open this brand new truck stop. Of course, I accepted. It's been 5 years since the place opened, and from what I hear, not a single one of the 60-plus employees we originally hired is still there. Things got strange from day one. During the grand opening, a woman delivering flowers dropped them on her foot, slicing it open and bleeding all over the entrance. Not exactly a good omen. Within the first week, sewage and water started bubbling up through all the drains inside and out. It wasn't raining, no flooding, nothing like that, just sewage, out of nowhere. Plumbers had no idea what caused it, and it disappeared as quickly as it came. Then came the storms. A massive one hit a few months after we opened and destroyed the high-rise sign off the interstate. We lost power for 7 hours, and despite taking precautions, several pieces of critical equipment got fried when the power came back on, causing operational problems for weeks. During that outage, a local employee casually mentioned that people had always been wary of this land because it was rumored to be a Native American burial ground. I couldn't confirm or deny it, but after everything that's happened, I wouldn't be surprised. The first winter was brutal, frozen pipes everywhere, including the truck care center and restaurant. We had to get space heaters just to keep the servers from freezing up. 6 months in, we had our first death. A truck driver came in to take a shower, and, after a couple of hours of no response, an employee went to check on him. She found him dead on the floor. He had a stroke. The poor employee who found him was understandably traumatized and left the company soon after. Not long after that, one of the strangest things I've ever witnessed occurred. I was temporarily managing the restaurant when the assistant manager from the store side came over, looking freaked out. She pulled up the security footage to show me a man in a small sedan pulling up to the truck side not the gas pumps. He got out, threw a trash bag on the compactor, and drove off. An hour or two later, he came back, climbed on top of the compactor, retrieved the bag, and threw it onto the roof of the maintenance shed before driving off again. One of the employees saw him and got curious. He grabbed a ladder, climbed up, and retrieved the bag. Inside were hundreds, if not thousands, of documents listing addresses across the United States. Under each address was a detailed description of where to find a body on the property. No names, just the gender and location of the bodies. We called the police, of course, but the chief of police, who hated us because truck stops bring crime, barely cared. He took the bag and the footage, but I doubt anything came of it. A couple of weeks later, a body of a recently deceased man was found across the street in a dump. He was bound, nude, and no one could determine where he had come from. Then there was the second death on the property, a driver found dead in his truck. The storms weren't done with us yet either. Another one destroyed the interstate sign again. I lost count of how many times that sign got taken out. We also had a scare with abandoned items, ratchet straps, and children's clothing, neatly folded, were left next to a diesel pump. It looked ominous, so we checked the cameras and called the police. Thankfully, this time it was a misunderstanding. The driver had cleaned out his truck after taking his kid home and thought someone could use the items. Innocent, but with everything else going on, it really freaked us out. About a year after opening, the state DOT had to shut down the on and off ramps to the interstate because the exit was collapsing. The business was nearly dead for weeks while construction crews rebuilt it. During that time, I got promoted and transferred to a different location. I kept in touch with the assistant manager and my former boss for a while, and the strange incidents continued. There were two major events that I remember hearing about before I lost contact. First, a man came into the truck stop wielding a machete. He was aggressive, terrifying the employees. State troopers had to come in with assault rifles to subdue him. No one knew where he came from, since the nearest town was 10 to 15 miles away. The second was a fight that broke out when a customer attacked a teenage cashier over a lotto ticket. The maintenance guy had to step in to defend the kid, and it turned into a full-blown brawl. After a while, I lost touch with everyone who worked there, so I'm not sure if the strange incidents ever stopped. Haunted a portal to hell? I don't know. All I know is, after that, I avoid truck stops whenever I can. For the past few years, my family has been experiencing strange, unexplainable occurrences that make me question what's real anymore. Every morning, my mother tells me she's been woken up in the middle of the night by unsettling figures in her room. These aren't vague shadows, but distinct, horrifying creatures. Some are small, pitch black with glowing red eyes and no mouths, while others are tall, ominous figures with devil horns. She insists she's fully awake when she sees them, and I believe her. My mother is a devout Christian, not the kind to joke about these things or let her imagination run wild. I can't even count how many times I've been jolted awake in the dead of night by her terrified screams. The sound is bone-chilling, and when I run to her room, she's always trembling, recounting the latest nightmare-like figures she's seen. It's never the same one twice. Each time, it's a new, terrifying entity. And each time, the fear is very real. It's not just my mother, though. My grandfather, who lives in the basement apartment of our house, has had his own encounters. He once told me about seeing blood dripping down the walls, spelling out messages he couldn't decipher. Another time, he swore an Indian woman was dancing beside his bed, warning him about something to do with his late wife. The most disturbing encounter he shared, though, is when he saw a girl who looked exactly like me standing next to his bed. The only difference, this version of me had blonde hair. It was eerie to hear him describe this doppelganger in such detail. At first, I dismissed these stories as the product of hallucinations, perhaps brought on by sleep paralysis or vivid dreams. But the problem is that these experiences aren't limited to just my mother and grandfather. My sister and I have seen things too. One night I woke up to see a man standing near the foot of my bed, watching me. He looked strikingly like my great-grandfather, but there was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. Another time, while lying in bed, I felt a cold, unmistakable poke on my shoulder, even though I was completely alone in the room. No one was there when I turned around. My sister has had her fair share of terrifying moments too. She's seen people running up and down the hallway late at night, their figures flickering in the dark. The strangest thing she's ever told me, though, is that she believes she once levitated in her sleep. As wild as it sounds, she swears by it. I find that part hard to believe, but given everything else we've experienced, I don't know what to think anymore. What really confuses me is that 2 other family members who live with us haven't had any strange encounters. It's as if whatever is haunting us has chosen specific targets, leaving the others in peace. I've often wondered why that is, why some of us are subjected to these experiences, while others seem immune. In an attempt to get answers, my mother invited a medium into the house a while ago. The woman saged our home and tried to communicate with the spirits. After walking around the house, she told us that a Victorian woman resides in my mother's room, constantly accompanied by a little girl. The revelation hit close to home because I had a sister who didn't survive long after birth. It's hard not to feel like there's some sort of connection there, even though I'm skeptical about mediums and their abilities. Despite all the explanations and encounters, I still don't know what to make of any of this. Is it really spirits or ghosts, or is there something else going on that none of us can understand? I can't shake the feeling that my family is caught in something far beyond the normal realm of reality, and I don't know if we'll ever truly know what's happening in our home. A few years ago, I had one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and it all started with a simple taxi ride. It was a late evening, and my ex-boyfriend and I were on our way home after a night out. We decided to call for a taxi, expecting a normal ride back. After waiting around 20 minutes, the cab finally pulled up. It was nothing out of the ordinary, a typical-looking taxi with its dim headlights cutting through the dark night. As soon as we got in, I noticed something felt a bit off. The driver didn't greet us or even acknowledge our presence, which was unusual. Most drivers at least say hello or exchange a few words, but this guy, nothing. He was completely silent, his breathing loud and labored, almost as if he was trying to control it. His heavy breaths filled the car, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy right from the start. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day, but I couldn't ignore how strange it all felt. After a few minutes of silence, the cab became stifling. The air inside felt thick, and it wasn't just from the lack of conversation. It was getting harder to breathe, and the closed windows weren't helping. I looked over at my ex, who was equally uncomfortable, and we decided to ask the driver if he could crack the window a bit. My ex-boyfriend politely asked, but there was no response. The driver didn't even flinch. It was as if we weren't there, or he was deliberately ignoring us. My ex tried again, this time raising his voice slightly, but again nothing. No reaction. The driver just kept his eyes glued to the road, his breath coming in those unsettling, heavy gasps. That's when I started paying closer attention to the road. Something was wrong. The route felt unfamiliar. I knew the streets well enough to notice that we should have been going in a different direction, but instead, we were heading down a road I didn't recognize at all. The surroundings looked wrong, darker, emptier. My stomach dropped as the uneasy feeling gnawed at me. It was as if we were being led somewhere we weren't supposed to go. I leaned over to my ex, whispering that I thought something wasn't right. His face was pale, his expression tense. He nodded slightly, clearly having noticed the same thing. But before either of us could say anything more, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. The door handles on the inside of the cab were broken on all sides. There were no handles, just jagged metal where they should have been. Panic started to bubble up inside me. I suddenly felt trapped, claustrophobic. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. We couldn't get out. The car was moving deeper into unfamiliar territory, and we were locked inside with a driver who was acting more and more bizarre by the second. I turned to my ex, trying to stay calm, but I could see he was just as scared as I was. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could think about was getting out of that car immediately. I told my ex in a low, urgent voice to ask the driver to stop the car, but I could tell from his expression that he was hesitant, afraid of what might happen if we did. Still, he gathered his courage and asked the driver, his voice trembling, "Hey, could you stop the car? We want to get out here." The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving, his breathing still labored and heavy. My ex repeated himself, this time louder, more forceful, "Stop the car. We need to get out now." For a moment, there was nothing, no change in speed, no acknowledgement. I was on the edge of full-blown panic, my fingers gripping the seat so hard that my knuckles turned white. And then, without warning, the driver slowly reached for the door lock on his side, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. What he did next sent a chill down my spine. Without turning to look at us, he used the fingers just to unlock the door. He opened it slightly, just enough for us to realize we could escape if we wanted to. It was eerie, almost as if he was mocking us, giving us an opportunity to leave, but in the most unsettling way possible. My ex and I didn't waste a second. We bolted out of the car, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The second our feet hit the pavement, the cab sped off into the night, disappearing down the road without another word. We stood there, shaken and confused, our hearts racing. The silence after the car disappeared was deafening. We never found out what that driver's intentions were. Maybe he was just strange, or maybe something far worse could have happened if we hadn't gotten out when we did. The broken door handles, the strange breathing, the silent soul of it added up to one of the most disturbing experiences I've ever had. Even now, years later, the memory of that night makes my skin crawl. Sometimes, when I think back on it, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't noticed the broken handles in time, or if the driver had refused to stop altogether. Whatever his deal was, I'm just thankful we got out of that car before anything worse could have happened. It all started around 1:05 a.m. I was waiting for my brother to get home. He's fasting, so I needed to grab his food, which is prepared by a chef. I was just casually looking out the window, checking to see if his car was pulling up. Instead of his car, though, I saw something far more alarming, a shadowy figure standing right outside our front garden. The figure was huge, easily around 6 even, or even 7 feet tall. It wasn't a person, or at least not anyone I'd ever seen before. There were no distinguishing features, just this dark, towering silhouette that seemed to blend into the night. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring, or at least it felt like it was staring right at my house. My heart immediately started racing, and panic set in. I've had anxiety attacks before, but this was something else. I felt frozen with fear. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of how late it was, but something about it felt far too real. I immediately grabbed my phone and tried calling a few friends. I just needed someone to talk me down, to reassure me that what I was seeing wasn't real. Out of all the people I tried to reach, only 2 were online. I told them about the shadow figure, hoping they'd help calm me down. Instead, they brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired or imagining things. Neither of them took me seriously. That only made things worse. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window again after that. The thought of seeing that thing still standing there terrified me. I remembered that we had cameras set up around the house, ones with motion sensors. They would have definitely caught something moving outside if it were there. So I quickly pulled up the live feed to see if the figure was still standing there. To my relief and confusion, the shadow was gone. The cameras didn't show anything unusual in the garden or near the house. The motion sensors hadn't even been triggered. But the fact that the cameras didn't catch anything didn't bring me much comfort. If anything, it made me feel worse. How could something that big just disappear without a trace? I decided to watch the playback footage, just to see if the cameras had recorded anything at all during the time I first saw the figure. I scrubbed through the video, but there was nothing. Not a single sign of movement outside the house. It was as if the shadow figure never existed, but I knew what I saw. There was no way I imagined something that vivid. By now, it was about 2 a.m., and my anxiety was through the roof. I felt completely unsettled, like something was still wrong, even though the figure was gone. I didn't know what else to do. I felt exhausted from all the stress and fear, so I eventually tried to sleep. But even as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking out there, watching my every move. The next morning, I thought about it over and over, replaying the events in my head. I couldn't figure out what I had seen or why it seemed to vanish without a trace. The whole thing felt surreal, but the fear I felt was all too real. I haven't told my family about it yet. I didn't want to worry them, but I can't stop thinking about it. I'm still wondering what or who was standing outside my house that night. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer. But one thing's for sure, I'm keeping my eyes on those cameras, and I'm never looking out the window alone at night again. This happened to me several years ago, and to this day, I haven't forgotten a single detail. One night I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when my black cat, Sabrina, scratched at my bedroom door to be let out. I was exhausted, but awake enough to shuffle over and open the door for her. She looked at me for a second, then walked over to the side door, signaling she wanted to go outside. I followed her and opened the screen door. After letting her out, I closed it, and that's when something caught my eye across the yard. My dad's old 1995 Chevy truck was parked in the neighbor's driveway, partially blocking the view of their house. Standing by the hood of the truck was a figure, a strange, horrifying figure. I could only see its shoulders and head, but what I saw will forever be burned into my memory. The thing's head was disproportionately large for its body, and its neck looked thin and frail. Its bony shoulders gave it a skeletal appearance, but the most terrifying part was its face or lack thereof. Where its eyes should have been, there were only two dark, empty sockets, like voids staring straight at me. Its pale skin contrasted sharply with those black hollows. And then there was its mouth, a wide, toothy grin stretched across its lower face. But its skin looked torn and shredded, especially around the jawline, where I could see exposed bone. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I wear glasses, so I figured maybe I was just seeing a blur or shadows from the bushes. But when I squinted to get a better look, everything became even clearer. The details were sharper: the wrinkles in its skin, the jagged edges of its torn flesh, the unsettling grin. My heart started pounding, panic set in, and I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. I backed away, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that what I had seen wasn't real. But deep down, I knew it was. I couldn't deny what I'd just witnessed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But the fear kept growing. I dashed back to my room, and, even though I was in my 30s, I did what any scared kid would do. I jumped into bed and pulled the blankets over my head. I felt like a child again, reliving the vivid night terrors that had haunted me when I was younger. That same feeling of being helpless, terrified, and alone washed over me. Even though my parents were just across the hall. As I lay there, trying to calm down, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Long, slow scratches on the wall next to my bed. It was coming from the side where I had just seen the creature. It was as if it had followed me and was now inside, dragging its nails across the wall. The sound was light but unmistakable, with each scratch punctuated by the faint thump of its fingers hitting the bumps on the surface. My fear turned into full-blown panic. Tears welled up in my eyes as I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was just imagining it. But the scratches continued, relentless and terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was feeding off my fear, enjoying the torment it was putting me through. After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. Silence filled the room. I stayed under the covers, too scared to move, still convincing myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. The next night, Sabrina scratched at the door again, wanting to go outside. I hesitated, dreading the thought of looking in the same spot where I had seen the creature the night before, but curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over. Nothing. There was nothing near the truck that even remotely resembled what I had seen the previous night. No shadows, no bushes, nothing that could have tricked my eyes. That's when the realization hit me. The thing I saw was real. And that thought, more than anything, terrified me. I never want to see that creature again, and I hope to God it never comes back. I wanted to share a creepy experience I had back in 2016. I think it was September, while on vacation in Aubernay, France. It's been a while, but this one stuck with me. So, my family, my parents, our dog, and me decided to take a holiday to this nice-looking house my mom had picked out near Aubernay. When we arrived, the landlady greeted us, but the communication was a bit off. She was French, and my parents don't speak much French or English. I was 12 at the time and couldn't speak much English either, so we were fumbling our way through the conversation. But one thing we all understood. She nervously insisted that we activate the alarm system every night and lock the doors to the lounge and winter garden using this heavy metal shutter. Honestly, to my 12-year-old self, it looked more like glass doors than a normal house shutter. There was something else strange. She didn't show us the whole house. That immediately struck us as odd. My dad and I, being curious, decided to explore a bit more on our own, and that's when we found some weird stuff. The house had two upstairs bedrooms and one on the ground floor. The bedroom on the ground floor seemed normal, except the window didn't close properly. But the upstairs, different story. One of the upstairs bedrooms had 5 or 6 beds all arranged so none of them faced each other. Strange, but we brushed it off as just an odd layout. The other upstairs bedroom had a huge bed and the second door near it, but the door was locked, and we didn't have a key. There was also a similar locked door across the hallway, next to the upstairs bathroom, which supposedly led to a small balcony. But, of course, we couldn't access that door either. Now, the creepiest part, the basement. The landlady didn't even show us the basement, but the key we had worked, so my dad and I went down to check it out. It started off like any normal basement, nothing out of the ordinary until we reached the far end. That's when things took a turn. The final part of the basement was tiled and featured an amateur mosaic of a red figure with black hair. To both my dad and me, it looked like a woman. Even weirder, my dad swore he saw meat hooks on the walls, though I couldn't confirm that. Despite all these red flags, we still stayed there for the entire week. And during that time, some really unsettling things happened. First of all, every night when it got dark, the house just felt off, like there was something lurking. That weird, oppressive feeling is somewhat normal in a creepy house, but this was different. I'm about 80% sure I heard noises coming from behind that locked door in the upstairs bedroom. It sounded like old floorboards creaking, like someone or something was moving around inside. Then there was this constant feeling of being watched. I felt uneasy and kind of down the entire time, which is not how you want to feel on vacation. Now I do bouts of paranoia sometimes, so I chalked some of it up to that. But this was on another level. The most terrifying thing that happened, though, involved our dog. We had an English Labrador retriever who was the most laid-back dog, ever no fear of fireworks, water, loud noises, nothing. But one night, in the middle of the night, he had what can only be described as a full-on dog panic attack. I wasn't in the room, so this is based on what my parents told me, that they said he woke them up, howling and wailing like something had scared him to death. He was shaking, terrified, and wouldn't calm down for almost 2 hours. It was completely out of character for him, and that freaked all of us out. Even though we stuck it out for the whole week, we were all relieved to leave that house. To this day, I still dream about it sometimes, and thinking back on it gives me chills. The weird locked doors, the strange basement, the landlady's nervous behavior, none of it made sense. If anyone's familiar with the area or can help me find this house again, please let me know. My parents don't remember the exact address, and I was too young at the time to take note of it. I can even draw a rough floor plan or recreate the mosaic if that might help. Anyway, I hope my story gave you a bit of a thrill, and thanks for reading. It was supposed to be a simple hike. Me and 2 of my buddies were looking for a trail in a local canyon, a pretty secluded area. The north-facing side of the canyon was blanketed in snow, but the south side was completely dry, with the only catch being that it was filled with vacation homes and private roads. We decided to take a little drive past the no trespassing signs and explore. These weren't your typical cozy cabins either. They had this eerie, villainous architecture, and most of them were completely empty. Well, except for one old man who gave us a friendly wave from his 3rd-story deck. It seemed like no one else was around, so we figured we could sneak in a short hike without getting into any trouble. There weren't any trails listed on the apps we usually use, but we found a path that kept us out of anyone's yard, and after a few minutes of walking, We had a decent view of the neighborhood below. It was just us, the mountain, and miles of untouched wilderness, no houses, no people above us. Then things got weird. As we hiked, we started finding objects hidden in the bushes and trees. All of them were sealed inside Ziploc bags that looked brand new, like they hadn't been exposed to the weather at all. At first, it seemed harmless. There were things like tennis balls and a sealed bottle of CBD tincture. We figure it was part of some scavenger hunt these rich vacationers played, because the trail was likely exclusive to them. But the further we went, the stranger the discoveries became. There were more and more of these Ziploc bags scattered around, like they'd been intentionally placed for someone to find. One of the more bizarre finds was a pair of nice earrings packed in a box and taped up inside a Ziploc bag, just lying out there in the wilderness. After a couple of hours of hiking and collecting weird stories to tell, we reached the end of the trail and decided to head back. But as we neared the bottom, still high enough above the neighborhood, we found one last Ziploc bag. It was placed inside a little tipi-like formation of sticks just off the trail. This time, inside the Ziploc was a silky black bag. Inside that bag, a pair of women's panties, fairly large if that matters, and a very old-looking chain. The chain was in pristine condition, still in its original box, with a jeweler's business card and everything. At first, we thought this was just another piece of the weird scavenger hunt, maybe part of some rich people's swinger game or something equally bizarre. But then, as I was putting it all back in the bag, I had a thought. This chain might actually be valuable. I mean, it looked old and expensive. So I said, half-jokingly, I'm gonna take this chain. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, 3 loud bangs echoed from further up the mountain. They sounded like massive boulders crashing down from the sky, and the noise was so close, it felt like the ground was shaking. But here's the thing, we had a clear view of the mountain. There was no construction, no signs of people or shelters up there. Nothing that could have caused those sounds. Instantly, the adrenaline kicked in. I shoved the chain back into the box, struggling to zip out the bag because my hands were shaking so badly. We didn't even hesitate after that. We sprinted all the way back to the car, feeling like something was following us, watching our every move. When we finally reached the car, we found a note on the windshield. It was a trespassing warning, but something about it was off. It was homemade, not like the official ones you get from law enforcement. It said something like, "No hiking allowed," and there was a photo of our license plate attached. It felt like someone or something had been watching us the entire time. Now, I've got a few theories about what could have been going on up there. My first thought is that the rich people who own those homes have cameras and speakers set up to scare off trespassers, because the police don't bother with minor trespassing cases in those areas. Maybe they triggered the sounds and left the note to mess with us. Another theory is that they set those items up on the trail as a trap, like they leave valuable-looking things out there, hoping someone will take them so they can charge us with theft. But does that even hold up legally? And here's my more far-fetched theory. Maybe someone planted their victims' belongings out there, clean of any fingerprints, hoping that people like us would find them and leave our prints behind. That way, we'd become suspects if the police ever found those items connected to a crime. I don't know. Maybe it was just a coincidence, and we were lucky enough to hear some random boulders fall while exploring a weird scavenger hunt game. But the whole thing still gives me the creeps. What do you guys think? Has anyone experienced something similar? Hello, I wanted to share my experience playing the red door, yellow door game. Before diving into it, I want to clarify that I don't necessarily believe anything supernatural happened, but I do think the game plays with your mind in interesting ways. I'm also curious to hear if anyone else has had a similar experience. I played the game with my friend at my house. We sat on my bed, and she guided me by repeating the phrase red door, yellow door, white door over and over. I tried to imagine doors in my mind, and before I knew it, I had a really vivid image of my surroundings. It was like my mind created this clear picture all on its own. What I saw was a dark brick hallway with 3 doors in front of me, a brown door on my right, a yellow door directly ahead, and a red door on my left. My friend asked me which door I wanted to open, and I decided to go for the brown one. So I walked over to it and opened it. At first, the door opened to nothing but darkness. But after a few moments, I could see something far off in the distance, a bench under a street light. There was a man sitting there, wearing a wizard hat of all things. He was dressed in regular clothes, like a t-shirt and pants, but for some reason he had that long, pointy hat on. He was sitting there, looking deep in thought, with his elbow resting on his knee and his hand on his head, like something was bothering him. The whole scene felt really unsettling. I don't know why, but I felt really uncomfortable. I stared at him for maybe a minute, but it just didn't feel right. I closed the door quickly and didn't tell my friend what I saw right away. I felt like I shouldn't, like something about it was just too weird to talk about. Eventually, though, my friend insisted that I tell her, and when I finally did, she got a bit annoyed, understandably, since you're supposed to share everything with the person guiding you. After that, I tried opening the yellow and red doors, but both of them led to nothing, just blank spaces. My friend then asked if I wanted to turn around and see what was behind me. I was hesitant, but agreed. When I turned around, I saw the same brick hallway, but now it split into 2 directions, left and right. There was a light on the wall in the middle, but it only illuminated the right side. The left side was pitch black, like the light couldn't even reach that far. My friend asked which direction I wanted to go, and I told her I wanted to go right, since the left side seemed too dark and creepy. So I walked down the hallway to the right. As soon as I turned the corner, I saw another hallway identical to the first one, with 2 directions again, but this time there was a tall man standing there. He was wearing a gray hoodie, with the hood up, his head down, and his fists clenched like he was ready to fight or something. He had jeans on and simple white shoes, like Adidas or something. Even though I couldn't see his face, I somehow knew that he was around 25 years old, and I knew that he wasn't the same person as the guy with the wizard hat. This guy was different, and I had this intense feeling that he wanted to harm me. I told my friend what I was seeing, and she immediately told me to turn around and leave. I tried, but even as I was walking away, I felt his presence right beside me, like he was following me. That's when I couldn't handle it anymore. I opened my eyes and ended the game. My friend told me that while I was playing, my eyes were moving really fast, like I was in a deep dream. She also said she could tell when I started feeling scared because my facial expressions changed. While I was under. As soon as I opened my eyes, I just started crying. I didn't expect to have such a strong emotional reaction, but the experience really got to me. So that's my story with red door, yellow door. Has anyone else had a similar experience with this game? I'd love to hear about it. It was a pretty normal evening for me. I'm 14, and I love baking. On this particular day, around 7:30 p.m., I decided to make a small batch of brownies. My sister, who's 19 and home from college for a few days, was sitting in the kitchen with me while I worked. We talked about a bunch of things, mostly her classes, but the conversation wandered all over the place. She was busy with her university work, but it was nice to have her around. The tray I used was only 9 by 9 inches, so the brownies didn't need long to bake. About 40 minutes. I remember making brownies almost every week back then. It was kind of my thing. As the brownies baked, my sister and I kept talking for another half hour or so. Eventually, she had to get back to her homework, so I texted my girlfriend for a bit just to pass the time. When the timer went off, I pulled the brownies out of the oven. The steam from the hot tray fogged up my glasses, and I remember laughing at how I could barely see anything. That batch of brownies, though, definitely the best I'd ever made. After that, the evening drifted into what any typical night for a teenager would look like. I spent the rest of the night on the phone with my girlfriend and watching Naruto Shippuden, the usual routine. The hours passed without me really noticing, and before I knew it, it was around 12:30 a.m. Hey, I'll be back in a minute. I forgot to put foil over the brownies from earlier, I told my girlfriend, planning to quickly run downstairs. Oh, okay. Love you. See you in a minute. Bye-bye. I left my phone in my room so it wouldn't mess up the call's duration. We were trying to break our record for the longest phone call. Quietly, I tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake up my parents or my sister, who were all asleep by now. Once I got to the bottom of the stairs, I turned left down the hallway and headed toward the dining room. The house was silent, just the faint creaks of old wood under my feet. I flipped on the light and walked into the kitchen, straight to the stove where I'd left the brownies cooling. I couldn't resist. I picked one up and set it on the counter to admire my work. But before I could get the foil, something strange happened. I heard a meow. Now, hearing a cat meow in my house is nothing unusual. We have indoor cats, and they're always lounging around somewhere, but this meow didn't sound right. It wasn't coming from any of our cats, who were all asleep in the living room, and our only outdoor cat was probably in the garage, also asleep. This meow didn't sound like a cat at all. It sounded like a man, a human voice, imitating a cat's meow. My blood ran cold as I realized where the sound was coming from. It came from right outside the kitchen window. Whoever or whatever was making that sound would have seen me the moment I turned on the light. They would have watched me walk past the dining room and into the kitchen. They were out there, staring at me from the dark, just beyond the window pane. Thought I froze. I didn't dare look outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands started to shake. I didn't want to know what was lurking out there. Quickly I covered the brownies with the foil, turned off the kitchen light, and bolted back upstairs as fast as I could, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. Back in the safety of my room, I grabbed my phone and told my girlfriend what had just happened. I was freaking out, trying to figure out if I was losing my mind. I even Googled the nearest mental hospitals just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. There were to within 9 miles of my house. Great. Sleep didn't come easy that night. In fact, I didn't manage to fall asleep until around 3:30 a.m., and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching the house. But the worst part, in my panic, I completely forgot that I'd left the brownie on the counter. I had to go back downstairs, into that dark, silent kitchen, to get it. That walk back down the stairs felt even more terrifying than before, knowing that something had been right outside that window just hours earlier. I grabbed the brownie as fast as I could and bolted back to my room, locking the door behind me. I still don't know what was out there that night, or if I even want to know. But ever since then, I've made sure to stay away from the windows after dark. And no matter how good my brownies turn out, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in that kitchen again. Hey there. I'm sending this story to a few of my favorite scary story narrators in hopes of getting some kind of explanation or at least some comfort. This happened back in June 2022, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. My buddy lives in a rural Welsh village with a population of probably fewer than 100 people. The houses are spread out, and it's around 3 to 4 miles from the nearest town or other village. Whenever I visit him, we like to go on nighttime walks along the country lanes since it's quiet, and you hardly see any cars after 10 p.m. This particular night was no different. I should mention his house is connected to an old chapel, and he's responsible for keeping it clean and looking after it. Earlier that evening, we were messing around inside the chapel, tossing a football and having a laugh. I think this part might be important. We didn't think much of it at the time, though. About half an hour later, we headed out for a walk. It was me, my friend Lucas, and another friend of ours, Reese. Lucas knows these roads like the back of his hand. He's lived there almost his whole life and has walked this route more times than he can count. We ended up about a mile away from the nearest village, near where an old, abandoned hotel used to be. The building has since been demolished, but there are still fences around where it used to stand. That didn't really creep us out, at least, until what happened next, as we were walking. Lucas pointed through a thick row of trees at what looked like a house. It had no lights on, and, despite walking this way countless times before, Lucas swore he had never seen that house there. He kept saying that the architecture seemed different from the other houses in the area, more European or Germanic. He thought his family is German. Naturally, he wanted to get a closer look, but weirdly enough, the house was blocked off by a construction fence that struck us as really odd. I shone my phone light through the fence, and we got a quick glimpse of the building. But that's when the weirdness really kicked in. Suddenly we all felt this overwhelming sense of dread. It was strange because it wasn't something we could explain. There wasn't a noise or anything that triggered it. The air around us seemed to still. There was no wind, no sound of insects, just pure silence. All three of us felt this at the same time. It made us extremely uneasy, so we decided to keep walking, moving away from the house. A little farther down the road, we found a wall that separated the trail from a field. We sat down on the wall to process what had just happened. Off in the distance, maybe about a mile away, we could see the village's church. We tried to laugh it off, throwing out jokes to cover how uneasy we were feeling, but then we heard something that chilled us to the bone. A single bell rang out from the church. Now, this was strange for several reasons. First, it was around 11:30 p.m. by that time, way too late for the church bells to be ringing. And second, the bell only rang once, which made even less sense. We all looked at each other, and Reese said what we were all thinking, that we shouldn't be there. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like we were somewhere we didn't belong. We agreed and quickly made our way back toward the path that led through the wooded area. The walk back to Lucas' place felt endless, and the sense of dread only got worse. None of us said a word the entire way back, and when we finally did talk, we all admitted that the house, along with everything else about that night, felt wrong. Lucas couldn't get over the fact that he had never noticed that house before, despite knowing the area so well. Something was off, and we all felt it. When we got back to the house, we pulled up a live satellite view of the area to see if we could find the house. But here's the thing. When we looked at the spot where we had seen the house, there was nothing there. Just dirt and overgrown shrubs. No house, no structure, nothing. That was when the fear really hit us. The house was there, we all saw it. Lucas had even pointed out the specific architectural details. And yet, according to the satellite view, it shouldn't have been there. None of us could shake the feeling that the place had been wrong. The church bell, the silence, the house. It all felt connected. Somehow Reese did some research online and found something about ley lines, prehistoric lines that run across the UK, which some believed to be linked to paranormal activity. She checked if any ley lines crossed in the area, and to our horror, we discovered that exactly where we had been sitting on the wall, the ley lines intersected. It sent a chill down my spine. Could that have explained the sense of dread we all felt? The next day, we went back to the spot in the daylight, hoping that the light would make things feel more normal. But when we got there, the house was gone. It was as if it had never existed. Even though it was bright and sunny, the area still felt off, like something was wrong with the land itself. The three of us were certain we had seen that house the night before. We know what we saw, but in the daylight, there was nothing there. I know this sounds insane, but we all experienced the same thing, and it's been stuck in my mind ever since. It's hard not to wonder if messing around in the chapel earlier at night had something to do with it. Maybe we stirred something up. I don't know. All I do know is that none of us has been able to make sense of what happened that night. We saw something that shouldn't have been there, and now I can't stop thinking about it. If anyone has an explanation, I'd love to hear it. When I was a teenager, I moved into my father's house in California for the first time. It was an old place situated right next to a cemetery, and over the years, I had some pretty bizarre experiences there. Now that I'm older, I sometimes joke with my friends about these incidents, thinking they were probably my own fault. But as strange as they were, I've never really shared the full story with anyone who might have insights. So here goes. My stepmother always claimed her deceased father was around and would mess with things whenever she and my dad had an argument. She'd say things like, "Oh, he hid his stuff again," if my dad couldn't find his car keys in the morning. I never believed it, though I figured she probably moved things around herself. But she and I would have open conversations about ghosts and the paranormal, and I've always had an interest in that sort of thing. Our house was right up against a cemetery fence, and I was 16 prime time for that edgy teenage phase. I loved listening to scary stories on YouTube while doing homework or painting. My stepmom and I had talked about Ouija boards before, and in my teenage rebellious spirit, I decided to buy one. I mentioned it to my friends, and they were all eager to try it out. The first time we used it was on Halloween night. It seemed like the perfect opportunity, so my friends and I snuck into the cemetery next to my house. Security was tight that night, so we hid behind a large tombstone to play. We were being careful not to be seen from the road, but after an hour of playing, absolutely nothing happened. I wasn't scared. In fact, I got a little cocky, thinking the whole Ouija board thing was a joke. The second time we used it was different and much more intense. This time, it was just me and my two friends, who, weirdly enough, shared the same name. To avoid confusion, I'll call them C and R. We decided to do it properly, following a quick how-to we found online. We lit candles, and C and I held the planchette while I read out the possible answers. To make it even spookier, C and I wore blindfolds. At first, nothing happened, but then the planchette started to move. I was convinced that C or R was messing with me, so I wasn't scared. We asked the entity its name, and while I can't remember the exact name, it was something ancient and Hebrew-sounding. Eventually we got bored, said goodbye, and moved on with our night. That's when the strange things started happening. At first, it was little stuff, so small that I can't even recall specific events. But over time, things escalated. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel a strong presence in the corner of my room near the door. Strangely, it never scared me. I somehow felt like the energy was female. So I'd just stare into the darkness for a while, then roll over and fall asleep again. The guest bathroom, though, was another story. I hated going in there. It was brightly lit, but the light wasn't comforting. It felt harsh, like the kind of light you'd find in a makeup store. I always felt uneasy in there, anxious even. I avoided it whenever possible. Then I got sick, really sick. It lasted for 2 weeks, and during that time my parents let me sleep in the guest bedroom. They used mine. They hated using the guest bathroom too, which is why they swapped rooms with me. But the guest bedroom was worse than I expected. It felt like all the energy in me was being drained, and I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. The whole time I was in that room, I felt like there was something heavy, dark, and oppressive hovering over me. The worst part, I kept hearing voices at night. I chalked it up to my fever, but it still creeped me out. Once I got better, I went back to my own room, but the strange energy followed me. That familiar corner of my room suddenly felt threatening. I started hearing strange noises in my room, scratching sounds coming from behind the wall, where there was nothing. I knew the sounds my room made, the AC, the door, the dogs on the other side, but these noises were new. I even complained about it so much that my dad had the house checked for rodents. Of course, they found nothing. Then I started feeling like something was touching me, and I walked down the hallway past the guest bathroom. It was always so subtle that I wouldn't notice right away, but later I'd realize it had happened. Around this time, I started blasting music everywhere I went in the house. I thought maybe if I couldn't hear the spirit, it wouldn't get worse. But one night, when my parents went out to dinner, I had a truly terrifying experience. I was in the laundry room scooping food for our 2 German shepherds when I heard a woman's voice say, "Hey, T." T is the nickname my family calls me, so I assumed it was my stepmother. I called out, "Yeah," without thinking, but then I realized I was home alone. My dogs had heard it too, their eyes fixed on the hallway. Then, like something out of a horror movie, one of the dog's balls rolled out from behind the kitchen counter and stopped at the wall. The dogs had been sitting right next to me, so there was no way they had dropped it. I was terrified, but I kept feeding them and hid in my room until my parents came home. The scariest thing, though, happened not long after that. I had smoked a little weed, which was something I didn't do often, and was coming down from it. I was relaxed, which was rare since I usually got paranoid when high. As I was getting ready for bed, I dropped a bowl of sewing pins on the floor. As I bent down to pick them up, I suddenly felt like the walls were closing in on me. I heard whispers all around and felt this unbearable pressure in my chest. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a deep growl. My entire body froze. I ran to my bed, pulled the covers over me, and hid. I called my best friend to comfort me, too scared to move. After that night, things calmed down a bit. I'd still hear a woman's voice occasionally, and sometimes the kitchen sink would turn on by itself. But I wasn't scared anymore. Not like I had been before. When we moved to another state, my stepmother threw out the Ouija board, and I've never had any experiences like that since. I still wonder, though, did using the Ouija board open some kind of door? Or was I just an anxious teenager projecting my fears onto the paranormal? I've thought a lot about it, but I still don't have answers. When I was about 12, my father took me to our family's longtime campground, where he needed to do some lawn care work before the camping season began. Since we'd likely be there a while, I asked if my friend could tag along to keep me entertained. My dad agreed, and for privacy, I'll call my friend D. D, and I shared a lot of interests, including a curiosity for the paranormal. So while my dad was mowing, I suggested we try an EVP electronic voice phenomena session in the campground's cafeteria to see if we could capture any spooky sounds or voices. D, always up for something eerie, happily agreed. The cafeteria was an unsettling two-story brick building. The upstairs housed the dining hall and kitchen, while the basement, known as the dungeon, was a mix of old dorm rooms and storage areas. The dungeon always gave me the creeps, with its dim lighting and long, narrow hallways. D, and I set up in the dining hall and started recording on my old flip phone's voice recorder. We spent about 5 minutes asking questions, but didn't get any responses. Then we heard faint noises coming from the dungeon below. We initially brushed it off as an animal, common enough at the campground, but after another 5 minutes, we heard something strange, a sound that made both of us freeze. It wasn't just any noise, it was chanting. Dee turned to me with wide eyes. "Is that chanting?" he asked. At this point, we were too freaked out to keep going. We left the cafeteria and went for a walk, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. I was doing my best to rationalize that there was no way anyone could be down in the dungeon. We would have noticed them, right? As we strolled about 60 yards from the back of the cafeteria, we saw a door with a window leading to the dungeon. I made a joke to Dee. How scary would it be if we looked over and saw someone staring back at us? We laughed nervously and turned to look, and then we saw them. Standing in the window were 3 people, cloaked, motionless, and staring directly at us. One was in a red cloak, and 2 were in black. Their faces were hidden under their hoods, but they were unmistakably looking straight at us. Before I could even speak, Dee took off running. Without thinking, I followed, sprinting to catch up. We ran straight to my dad, breathlessly explaining what we had seen. He brushed it off, but to put our minds at ease, he said he'd go check out the dungeon himself. My dad wasn't someone to mess with. At 6'5" and nearly 300 pounds, he was an imposing figure. If anyone was down there, they'd definitely think twice about messing with him. We watched as he entered the dungeon, checked around, and came back out. "There's no one there," he said casually. I felt a bit better, but Dee and I still steered clear of the cafeteria for the rest of the day. Years later, I'd almost forgotten about the whole incident. One evening, I was sitting on my parents' deck with my older brother, reminiscing about our childhood. When the topic of spooky campground experiences came up, I told him the story about Dee and me seeing the people in CLOAKS. My brother's face went pale. "You're joking," he said. I shook my head, insisting it was true, and even mentioned that Dee could back me up. My brother then told me something that has haunted me to this day. When I was just 2 years old, a satanic cult had broken into the campground. They went through every dorm and even the church, gathering all the Bibles. They took them to a field across the road from where Dee and I had seen the cloaked figures. In the middle of this field, the cultists had burned a massive pentagram into the ground. They placed the Bibles in the center and set them on fire. Worse yet, they scattered the remains of dead animals around the pentagram in a ritualistic pattern. When the maintenance workers found the scene the next day, they immediately called the police. After that, no one ever heard from the cult again, or so we thought. What my brother told me, combined with what Dee and I had experienced, chilled me to the bone. Did we stumble upon a new gathering of this cult years after the original incident? Or was it something else entirely? To this day, I can't be sure, but I find it hard to believe it was anything other than the latter. Several years ago, when my son was around 3 or 4 years old, he said something that completely caught me off guard. We were in the car just running a typical errand to pick up his older brother from school, when he suddenly piped up from the back seat with a very strange request. "I want to go home," he said in his tiny voice. I smiled and reassured him. "Don't worry, Bubba. As soon as we get your brother, we'll head home." But his reply sent chills down my spine. "No, Mom. My home in the sky." With God, I almost hit the brakes. "Excuse me. What did he just say?" I was in complete shock because we never went to church, and we hadn't really talked about God in our household. It wasn't a topic we discussed, so hearing this out of the blue left me both confused and shaken. I couldn't even respond. I just kept driving, but my mind was racing. That wasn't the only bizarre thing he said at that age, either. Around the same time, he shared something even more unsettling. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the living room, he looked at me with these big, innocent eyes and said, "You're my favorite mom. You're the best mom." Naturally, I smiled, thinking he was just being sweet. But then he continued, and the next words out of his mouth made my heart skip a beat. "My other mom let me drown when the horse and buggy fell off the bridge. She saved herself, but she didn't save me. I went to be with God, and then I got to pick you to be my new mom." I froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. It was so detailed, so vivid for a child so young, and the fact that we'd never exposed him to any concepts like that. No church, no conversations about God, no stories about past lives made it all the more unnerving. I didn't know how to respond, and honestly, I didn't even know what to think. I just sat there, completely at a loss for words. The imagery he described was something out of a different time, a horse and buggy falling off a bridge. Where could a 3 or 4-year-old possibly get that from? It wasn't like we watch any period dramas or read any books that could have planted that idea in his head. Even though he's almost 10 now, he doesn't remember any of these things he told me back then. I've asked him about it a few times, casually bringing it up, but he just looks at me like I'm crazy and shrugs it off. It's as if those memories, if that's what they were, vanished completely as he got older. But the way he talked about it back then, it wasn't like he was telling a made-up story or something from his imagination. It was so matter-of-fact, like he was recounting something that had truly happened to him. I've often thought about those moments, especially when I reflect on how little we talked about God or anything spiritual in our household. What he said came entirely from him, with no external influences that I can recall. It leaves me wondering if there's more to this world than we understand, especially when it comes to children and the things they seem to know or remember from places we can't quite explain. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of it. Maybe it was just a child's vivid imagination, or maybe there's something deeper going on. Either way, those moments still stick with me, making me question things I thought I understood about life, death, and whatever comes after. All I know is I've never forgotten what my son told me about his other mom and the life he lived before he came to be with me. This isn't exactly what you'd call a scary story, but it's definitely strange and has stuck with me over the years. So, here it goes. I was born in 2005, which makes me 19 this year. My great-grandpa passed away in 2009, just 3 days before my birthday, but about a week before he died, something happened that I've never been able to fully explain. I was just 3 years old, about to turn 4. I remember it clearly, one of those early childhood memories that stays with you for some reason. I was sitting in the living room, happily playing with my Barbie dolls, while my great-grandpa and great-grandma sat on the couch, chatting. Everything about that moment felt normal. The room was filled with the warmth of family, and I was just a little kid in my own world of toast. At some point, the front door opened, and my mom walked in. She was holding my baby sister, who was only a few months old at the time, and my sister's dad was with her. It seemed like a perfectly ordinary moment, my mom coming home with my little sister, everyone just going about their day. I didn't think much of it at the time. In fact, I grew up thinking that my great-grandpa had met my sister that day. I just assumed it, because why wouldn't he have? I'd remembered that scene so vividly for years. But here's where it gets strange. When I turned 13, I started thinking about that memory again, and something didn't quite add up. My sister was born in January 2010, and my great-grandpa passed away in 2009. He died before she was even born. But if that's true, then how could I have this crystal clear memory of him meeting her? It didn't make any sense. For years I believed that day had actually happened, but now I was left questioning everything. At first, I thought maybe I'd just gotten confused, so I talked to my mom about it. I told her what I remembered the day she came through the door with my baby sister and my great-grandpa sitting there on the couch. She looked at me just as puzzled as I was. According to her, there was no way that could have happened. She confirmed what I already knew. My sister was born months after my great-grandpa passed. She didn't even babysit other children during that time because she was busy with college and work. So it couldn't have been someone else's baby either. We both sat there, kind of stunned. I mean, I had no reason to make something like that up, and I wasn't the type of kid who confused dreams with reality. I was absolutely convinced that it had happened. The memory felt as real as any other, and it wasn't some hazy, half-remembered moment. It was detailed right down to the way the living room looked, how my great-grandpa and grandma were sitting on the couch, and how my mom carried my sister through the door. But the facts didn't lie. My great-grandpa never could have met my sister in real life. Yet, somehow I had this vivid memory of him doing exactly that, as if I'd witnessed it unfold with my own eyes. It's not like I'd heard stories about it or anything, because it wasn't possible in the first place. There was nothing that should have planted that idea in my head. Even now, I still think about it sometimes. I wonder what it was. Was it just a random, strange trick of my mind? A confusion of timelines that got jumbled up in my young brain? Or was it something else entirely, something I can't explain? I don't claim to know the answer. Maybe it was a vision. Maybe it was some kind of glimpse into a reality that wasn't supposed to happen. Or maybe it was just my imagination. All I know is that it felt real, and it still does when I think about it. It's one of those things that makes you question what's real and what isn't, and whether we sometimes experience things that don't fit neatly into the rules of time and memory. Even though I'm older now and more logical about these kinds of things, that memory still lingers in the back of my mind. It's one of the earliest memories I have, and no matter how much I try to make sense of it, I keep coming back to the same unsettling thought. I remember something that shouldn't have been possible. My friends and I, who I'll refer to as a E, S, and D if needed, have been dabbling in paranormal investigations over the past few years. We're not professionals, but it's something we enjoy when we're all able to get together. We've gone to a few supposedly haunted spots, but nothing prepared us for what happened during this investigation. One day, we were trying to decide where to go next. We had just wrapped up another investigation a couple of nights prior and were still feeling pretty bold. During our conversation, one of my friends suggested an old abandoned school in rural Tennessee. We had heard rumors about this school through YouTube and other online sources. If you've ever heard of the boy who was bullied to death and buried underneath the floorboards, then you know the place I'm talking about. But if you haven't, here's a quick backstory. A young boy was cornered in the boys' bathroom by a bully who beat him so badly that he died on the spot. In a panic, the bully pulled up the floorboards with a pocket knife and stashed the boy's body beneath them. The cruelty of the act is said to have left the school haunted by not only the boy's spirit, but also a dark, malevolent force. Some even believe this dark presence is what drove the bully to go too far and kill the boy. Now back to our story. Sadly, our friend couldn't join us for this trip, so I invited another friend, H, to fill in. He wasn't as into the paranormal as we were, but he agreed to tag along for something to do. When we finally arrived at the school, we quickly realized that the online videos and photos didn't do it justice. This place was seriously creepy. The building was covered in vines, graffiti, and broken windows. The doors were off their hinges, likely from local teens breaking in for kicks. We explored the perimeter before finding the entrance to the basement, the place we had heard you should never go, especially the boiler room. Supposedly, that's where the dark entity lives. Naturally, it was the first place we wanted to check out. The basement itself was nothing special, just broken down equipment, graffitied walls, and debris everywhere. There was a random school chair in the corner, which felt unsettling, like it had been placed there on purpose. He made a joke about how the spirit couldn't be that powerful if it had to stay in a dump like this, and we all laughed. In hindsight, maybe mocking it wasn't the best idea. After leaving the basement, we headed into the main school building, which wasn't any better. Collapsed ceilings, graffiti, and trash were everywhere. We explored the classrooms, gym, and eventually we found the boys' bathroom where the bullied boy was supposedly buried. Once we finished scoping things out, we began our investigation. We set up a few cameras, motion sensors, and voice recorders in the classrooms and hallways. Some of us stayed in one of the classrooms playing with dowsing rods and a spirit box, while H and I stood in the hallway outside. As they were asking questions with the dowsing rods and spirit box in the classroom, H and I heard a loud bang from down the hall near a collapsed section of the floor where we assumed a staircase had been. We shined our flashlights. Tut didn't see anything, so we shrugged it off as an animal or something. I joined the others in the classroom, but H stayed in the hallway, still uneasy. Suddenly, he turned pale and called out to us, "I don't want to freak you guys out, but I swear I just saw someone poke their head out from around the corner and look right at me." We dismissed it as his mind playing tricks, but his insistence and the look on his face spooked us. Not wanting to escalate his nerves, we moved to another part of the building, but as we were discussing where to go next, we all heard it, a child's laugh echoing from the classroom we had just left. We froze, as broke the silence. What was that? Feeling brave or maybe foolish, he walked toward the classroom to investigate. I had this gut feeling something bad would happen, so I grabbed his arm, but he shrugged me off and kept going. The moment he stepped through the doorway, we heard a loud crash. The floor had collapsed right where we had been standing earlier. Had I not grabbed him, he could have fallen into the pit below. Shaken but undeterred, we moved to the gym, where the floor felt sturdier. I took the dowsing rods and started asking the typical questions. Is anyone here? Can you point to where you are? To my surprise, the rods pointed toward the darker corner of the gym. Guys, come here. I'm getting responses, I shouted. But as the others approached, the rods stopped pointing toward the corner and instead followed E. The same guy who nearly fell through the floor earlier. Wherever he moved, the rods followed him. Left, right, even in a full circle, they wouldn't stop. Then someone asked, "Are you mad at him?" The rods instantly stopped moving and went dead still, and an eerie silence filled the room. I got a terrible feeling, like something dark had entered the room. Then, without warning, the rods in my hands started thrashing violently, as if something was trying to rip them away from me. All around us, we heard the sounds of doors slamming, objects being thrown, and worst of all screams. Panic set in, and that's when H pointed to the corner of the gym and screamed like I've never heard before. He was pointing at something, but none of us dared to look. All we could think about was getting out of there. We grabbed our gear and bolted. After speeding back to my place, we tried to calm down and process what had just happened. When H finally spoke, he described something that still haunts me. He said he saw a massive figure, at least 7 feet tall, with long, gangly arms spread wide. Its head had long, devilish horns, and its mouth was open so wide that you could probably fit a whole head in there. But worst of all was the smile and evil, sinister grin. Looking back, I think we're lucky to have made it out alive. We've never returned to that school, and we have no plans to. If that place were demolished and the rubble burned, they'd be doing the world a favor. Whatever haunts that school should stay buried forever. So if you ever find yourself near that old school, do yourself a favor, stay away. What we saw that night will forever be burned into our minds and haunt us in our nightmares. When I was 19, I was in my second year at a tough-to-get-into university, growing up in a very strict, religious household with emotionally distant, almost absent parents. I had little experience with the world outside our church community. Even within that community, I was often ridiculed by older, bigger kids. My family moved around a lot, and my parents were socially awkward, never making friends. It left me feeling isolated most of the time. Around that time, there was this weird, unsettling movie being released in theaters. What got me wasn't just the plot itself, but the fact that it seemed to draw specific, eerie parallels to my own life. 6, to be exact. It followed a man who worked in a sterile, empty pawn shop, and he was eccentric, to say the least. He had no family, no father, and he didn't seem to understand how to handle ordinary situations. At one point, he even poured concrete down a bathroom drain to deal with the smell of sewage. He was socially awkward, bitter, and rude. Here's where things got freaky. There were these bizarre details in the movie that matched my life in ways that were too specific to ignore. The man kept holding and staring at a glass eye. My older sister has a small, non-functioning eye. There was a customer in the film who kept saying, "Life is hard," a phrase my father had repeated to me my entire life. The main character's father was absent, just like mine. His awkwardness and bitterness felt like a mirror of my own social struggles. There was also the smell of sewage coming from the bathroom drain in the movie, which was an issue I was dealing with at home. And then there was his strange fixation on a waitress's butt, non-sexual but unsettling. I'd grown up around someone with a similarly disproportionate body, and it was impossible not to notice, even though it made me uncomfortable. Soon after watching that film, my relationship with my girlfriend fell apart. What followed was a mental unraveling. I became convinced her father was trying to kill me, and that some kind of moral police were tracking my every move, accusing me and setting me up to be murdered. I thought every car on the road was out to kidnap me. At my worst, I was terrified to even get into my car, convinced it would explode the moment I turned the key. It got so bad that I started hiding, knives around me, preparing for an attack that never came. I was eventually found walking down the highway, headed to a nearby city by foot, crying and convinced my life was about to end. There was no logic behind it, just a constant, overwhelming feeling of impending doom. I've heard people say that movies and stories are just fictional products, but this one felt different. I can't shake the feeling that it was somehow crafted to target and destabilize me personally, like a cruel form of sorcery. Maybe it was just paranoia, or maybe there really was something or someone behind it, manipulating my life from the shadows. Whether it was pure coincidence or something more malicious, I'll never know. But that movie left a scar I'll carry forever. When I was single, I decided to give online dating a try and came across a guy named William. At first, everything seemed normal. We exchanged a few messages, nothing out of the ordinary. Eventually, we traded numbers, and that's when things started to take a strange turn. On our first phone call, his tone shifted dramatically. He began referring to me as his pet, which immediately made me uncomfortable. To make it worse, he launched into some bizarre intelligence test. I went along with it at the time, trying to keep things light, and I passed his test, but that didn't stop his behavior from becoming even more unnerving. What really set off alarm bells was when he suggested I visit him to star in a homemade horror film. The role he had in mind, a belly dancer performing in creepy, grotesque scenes. He casually mentioned a plan involving us bathing in a tub full of fake blood at least. I hoped it would be fake, and it didn't stop there. He had other disturbing ideas, like taking me out into the woods for some hypnosis experiments, all using an emerald necklace. At that point, it was clear to me that this was not just some quirky guy, but someone with deeply unsettling intentions. I decided it was time to end our communication. As I was about to block him, I couldn't help but glance through his profile one last time. That's when I found pictures that made my skin crawl. He was bald, covered in tattoos, and his eyes were hauntingly pale, thanks to creepy white contact lenses. In one photo, he was standing in what looked like a blood-stained garage, wearing a ski mask. I hoped that the blood was fake, but at that point I wasn't willing to find out. I blocked him immediately and tried to push the entire experience out of my mind. Years went by, and I almost forgot about William. But one evening, while driving home from the mall, a car pulled up next to me. To my horror, It was him, William. He gave me an eerie grin and a slow, knowing wave. My heart pounded as I watched him speed away, the memories of our bizarre conversations rushing back. That night I triple-checked all my doors and windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What if I had agreed to meet him? What could have happened? I'm thankful for the instincts that led me to block him back then. From that moment on, I was much more cautious about who I let into my life, especially online. It was a lesson I won't soon forget. When I was a teenager, my family and I used to go camping regularly. We started with tent camping and eventually upgraded to a pop-up camper. This particular story, though, takes place during one of our tent camping trips. One late afternoon, my dad and I were sitting around a small fire. It wasn't much, just enough to eventually cook dinner. Out of nowhere, a massive spider appeared. This thing was unlike anything I had ever seen before, big, black, and grotesque. It came crawling straight toward me, and I screamed so loudly I'm sure I made the entire campground think someone was being murdered. To quiet me, my dad jumped up and stomped on the spider. "A dead spider can't hurt you," he said. But he was wrong. About 10 to 15 seconds after he lifted his foot, the spider reformed and started crawling at me again, its legs crooked and twitching. I screamed even louder and started crying. My dad, now in a state of panic, threw a cinder block at the spider. I saw one of its legs sticking out from under the block, but the leg slowly pulled back under the cinder block, and the spider crawled out through one of the holes. This only added to my terror, as it seemed like this creature was now on a vendetta, with the spider still coming for me. My dad, thoroughly terrified, kicked the spider into the smoldering fire. The flames roared to life as I finally stopped crying, feeling relieved. My dad was patting himself on the back, proud of having killed the thing. Just when I thought it was over, the spider emerged from the fire with flames on its back. It was crawling toward me, hissing loudly and moving faster than I thought possible. I was frozen in fear, crying uncontrollably, desperate. My dad stomped on the spider, risking his shoe catching fire in the process. He kicked it back into the flames, and I hoped this time it was really dead. But when the fire died down, there was no trace of the spider's corpse. Since then, I've refused to go tent camping. There's a part of me that's convinced the spider is still out there, waiting for a chance to get me. I'm not willing to give it that opportunity. This story took place when I was about 10 years old. I'm 16 now, but my sisters and I still laugh about it every now and then. We lived in a small, quiet neighborhood on the lower end of town. It was peaceful, especially at night, although the street lights were dim and some were broken. At the far end of our street, there was a dark, wooded area next to the biggest house, which belonged to a neighbor we'll call Mr. H. The houses on our street were small on one side and slightly larger on the other, but Mr. H.'s was the largest. One weekend night in the fall, my sisters, S and L, who were 8 and 6, and I were outside, playing and running up and down the street. The street lamp near Mr. H.'s house flickered and buzzed, but it didn't do much to light up the area. As we were talking, I heard something rustling in the bushes in Mr. H.'s yard, and I told my sisters to be quiet so I could listen. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At the back of the yard, I could see something moving in the shadows. It didn't take long before a large shape emerged from the bushes. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but then it stood up on its hind legs. It was a bear. Now, we have black bears in the area, but it was unusual to see one this close to home. But being a 10-year-old with an overactive imagination, my first thought wasn't bear. It was werewolf. It had dark, matted fur and was about 7 feet tall when standing. I froze, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The bear looked around as if it had heard us. Then my sister S decided to shout, "Mr. H, is that you?" She yelled as if a bear could somehow be mistaken for our neighbor. The bear immediately dropped back onto all fours and locked its eyes on us. For a moment, everything was silent. All we could hear was the bear's heavy breathing and the faint sniffing sounds as it tried to figure out what we were. Then it started walking toward us. Panic hit, and I knew we had to run. L started screaming, and S just stood there frozen. I grabbed both of their hands and yanked them, and we bolted down the street as fast as we could. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the bear's steps behind us, getting closer with every second. I was sure we were going to be caught. When we reached our house, out of breath and hearts racing, we pounded on the door until our parents let us in. We were safe, but of course they didn't believe our story about a werewolf in Mr. H's yard. They brushed it off as a wild tale from over-imaginative kids. Looking back, I'm thankful that the bear didn't chase us all the way. We wouldn't have had a chance. We were lucky, and even though we joke about it now, that night scared us more than anything. In the end, we all lived happily ever after, or something like that. This incident happened about 6 years ago, but I still think about it all the time, and it gives me chills. I was 11 at the time, and two of my friends, E, also 11, and S, who was 13, decided to spend the night camping in a tent in my backyard. Now, let me paint the picture for you. I live way out in the middle of nowhere. My house sits on 4 acres of land, and about half of it is this wide open space surrounded by thick rows of trees. It's pretty secluded, so we felt like we were all alone in our little camping adventure. We spent the first part of the evening around a campfire that we built right in the middle of the clearing. It was just the 3 of us hanging out, laughing, and talking for hours. My dog, Chester, may he rest in peace, he was such a good boy, was out there with us too. He barked and growled a couple of times, but to be honest, I didn't think much of it. Chester had always been the type to bark at random stuffed squirrels, rustling leaves, you name it, so it didn't raise any red flags at the time. I just figured he was doing his usual routine, keeping an eye out for anything moving around in the dark. After a while, we got tired and decided it was time to settle into the tent. We grabbed our stuff, crawled inside, and started watching a movie. By the time the movie ended, it was about 2 a.m., and we were ready to go to sleep. Chester started barking again, but just like before, I brushed it off. I didn't realize how odd it was that he was barking so much looking back now. It should have been a warning sign, but I didn't think much of it in the moment. S had already fallen asleep. I was drifting off myself, and he was still awake when something strange happened. Out of nowhere, someone or something tripped over the rope that was tied to the tent. The next thing I knew, something heavy fell right on top of my head. I was half asleep at the time, so it didn't startle me as much as it should have. I thought maybe it was my dad checking on us, making sure we were okay. That made sense in my groggy state, but whatever or whoever it was didn't stop there. It got up, walked to the front of the tent, and started to unzip the door, and not quickly, like you'd expect if someone was just peeking in. It was a slow, deliberate unzip, like they were being careful not to make too much noise. Something in me told me to pretend I was still asleep. I didn't dare look. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. But I stayed still, barely breathing. The tent door stayed open for what felt like an eternity, maybe a minute or two. Oh, it felt much longer. Whoever it was didn't say a word. They just stood there, staring inside. Then, just as slowly as they'd unzipped it, they zipped the door back up and walked away. That's when my friend, he nudged me, terrified. She asked me who it was, but I just shrugged it off and told her it was probably my dad. I figured she was just scared because we'd watched a horror movie earlier that night, and maybe her imagination was getting the best of her. I should have taken her more seriously, but at the time I didn't feel scared. I just assumed it was nothing. Morning came, and we all went inside, eat breakfast with my family. While we were sitting at the table, I mentioned to my dad how he'd tripped over the tent rope last night and hit my head. I was ready to tease him about it, but he just looked at me, totally confused. He had no idea what I was talking about. He said he never went outside to check on us that night. That's when I started to feel uneasy. If it wasn't my dad, then who or what was it? I thought maybe it could have been my older brother messing with us, but he wasn't even home that night. He was staying at a friend's house, so now I was starting to get a little freaked out. I asked Dee about it again. She was the only one awake and aware when it happened, and I needed to know what she saw. She told me she'd been pretending to sleep too, but she peeked out of the corner of her eye when the door unzipped. And what she saw, it wasn't my dad. She said it was a figure with a long beard and big ears staring into the tent. It just stood there, watching us. That's when the fear really set in for me. If it wasn't my dad or my brother, then who or what was standing outside our tent in the middle of the night? The strangest part of all this was how isolated we were. We didn't hear any vehicles approaching, no footsteps leading up to the tent, nothing. It was as if this person or thing just appeared out of nowhere. How did they get so close to us without making a sound? And why did they do nothing more than unzip the tent and stare inside? The whole thing was beyond creepy. To this day, I have no idea what really happened that night. I'm convinced it wasn't my dad because he would never scare us like that, and he would have come clean if it was him. We were just 3 young girls, all alone in a tent, and whoever or whatever visited us that night had intentions that still make me shiver. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pretended to be asleep. Would things have turned out differently? Would we have been in danger? Needless to say, I never had another backyard sleepover after that. I never intended for things to get this far. All I wanted was some extra cash. I've always been charismatic, not bad-looking, and I know how gullible some of those spiritually active women can be, especially the middle-aged ones. Yeah, I know I'm an asshole, but I was in a financial bind. I wasn't trying to start a cult. I wasn't going to have people drink poisoned Kool-Aid, and I definitely didn't want multiple wives. I just needed some quick money to get back on my feet. To my surprise, it worked a little too well, actually. One of my exes was really into crystals, astrology, meditation, all that stuff, so I knew enough to sound convincing. I created a website, called it Eternal Enlightenment, and started running ads on various spiritual websites. I kept things simple. White clothes, cross-legged on a cushion, with the golden hour light spilling in from my apartment balcony. I'd record myself talking about chakras, divine energies, and the path to enlightenment, telling people how they could achieve spiritual transcendence just like I had. Clips of my videos were free, but for full access, it was $99 a month or $800 for the year. And as ridiculous as it sounds, people bought in, the money started flowing in quickly. Within 6 months, I had around 40 members, and by the end of the first year, that number had tripled. Everything was going great. I even started promoting some members, telling them they had reached a higher level of enlightenment, and sent them off to speak at conferences. I adopted the name Sri Deepa, which I claim was given to me by monks during my imaginary training in India. By month 20, I was pulling in $75,000 a month. I had upgraded my setup, playing with light to make myself appear to glow, and even giving the illusion that I was levitating a few inches above the ground. I'd gone all in, even building a retreat in the desert where members would come for enlightenment seminars. But after 2 years, growth slowed, new sign-ups dwindled, and I started getting desperate to keep things moving. I needed something big to grab attention again. That's when a member of my inner circle suggested a transmission of enlightenment, some ritual she had read about in an ancient text. She could actually read Sanskrit and had gotten hold of some book filled with supposed Buddhist or Hindu magic. It sounded too out there, even for me, but, feeling the pressure, I figured, why not? I didn't believe in any of this, and I assumed nothing would actually happen. I prepared for the ritual at the retreat, attended by a dozen of my most loyal followers. I set the scene, dim lights, incense burning, and a recording of low, rhythmic chanting. I was in full performance mode, dressed in gold and red robes. My volunteer, the woman who had suggested the ritual, stood before me as I recited a butchered version of the Sanskrit incantation from her book. The atmosphere was intense, and everyone was buying it. I raised my hands, calling on everyone to channel their energies into me, and then touch her forehead lightly with my middle finger. The spotlight hit her as she immediately collapsed, her body writhing on the floor. At first I thought it was part of her act to sell the ritual, but then her body stiffened, her eyes rolled back, and her skin started to wither into a gray, lifeless husk. The room filled with horrified gasps. Thinking on my feet, I told the others that she must have had impure intentions and had been unworthy. I had a couple of members carry her body away, while I made a quick exit to my private quarters. That was for days ago. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The skin on my right hand, the one I touched her with, has turned gray, dry, and cracked. It's spreading up my arm, and I can't move it anymore. The rot is creeping toward my chest, and I have no idea how to stop it. Every night, I'm plagued by nightmares of monstrous creatures tearing me apart. There are about 80 people here at the retreat, and they're growing restless. My inner circle has been trying to keep the others calm, but rumors are spreading, and people are demanding answers I don't have. I know my time is running out. I can feel it. The decay is eating away at me, and the people I've conned are at my door, growing more impatient and angry by the hour. I made a terrible mistake, and now I'm paying the price. I don't know what's going to kill me first, the curse, or the mob that's waiting outside. I work as a delivery driver for a small courier company. It's not the most exciting job, but it's easygoing and pays the bills. It's mostly solitary work, which I never minded until last week. That night I was assigned a late-night delivery to an address I'd never seen in our usual system. A big, old mansion on the edge of town. The kind of place that makes you think of creaky floorboards and ghost stories, but I shrug it off. We get odd requests sometimes. When I got there, the place looked almost abandoned. It was pitch dark, and the only sound was the slow groaning of iron gates as they creaked open for me. The driveway was long, lined with dead trees that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. The mansion was huge and imposing, every window dark, as if the place hadn't seen life in years. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, and it opened almost immediately. An elderly woman stood there, her face hidden in the shadows, but her voice was soft and polite. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Would you mind bringing the package inside?" "I'm too weak to carry it myself." I didn't hesitate. She seemed harmless, just old and frail. I grabbed the package, a simple and marked cardboard box, and followed her inside. The mansion's interior wasn't much better than its outside, dim, musty, filled with dusty old furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. It smelled like time had forgotten this place. She led me to a small room, lit only by a few flickering candles. There was a large, ornate mirror dominating one wall. "Just leave it here," she said, pointing to the table in front of the mirror. I put the box down, but something wasn't right. I glanced at the mirror and froze. The reflection wasn't showing the same room I was in. It was showing a decayed, older version of the room. The walls in the reflection were crumbling, and thick cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It was like looking into the future, or maybe the past. I turned to ask the woman about it, but she was gone. The door behind me had somehow shut itself, and I could feel the air in the room grow colder. Panic started to set in. I knocked on the door. No response. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, like someone muttering in the dark, but they grew louder and more insistent. I turned back to the mirror, and what I saw made my heart stop. The decayed room in the reflection was warping. Shadows were moving, twisting into figures that looked like they were watching me, waiting. I felt trapped. The door wouldn't budge, and my phone had no signal. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, and the candles were flickering as if they could blow out any second. My breath quickened, and I realized I wasn't alone. There was something in there with me. In desperation, I opened the box I'd delivered. It felt heavy, but when I lifted the lid, there was nothing inside except an old-fashioned key and a note. The note read, "Thank you for your service. You may stay as long as you wish. I work as a delivery driver for a small courier company. It's not the most exciting job, but it's easygoing and pays the bills. It's mostly solitary work, which I never minded until last week. That night I was assigned a late-night delivery to an address I'd never seen in our usual system. A big, old mansion on the edge of town. The kind of place that makes you think of creaky floorboards and ghost stories, but I shrug it off. We get odd requests sometimes. When I got there, the place looked almost abandoned. It was pitch dark, and the only sound was the slow groaning of iron gates as they creaked open for me. The driveway was long, lined with dead trees that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. The mansion was huge and imposing, every window dark, as if the place hadn't seen life in years. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, and it opened almost immediately. An elderly woman stood there, her face hidden in the shadows, but her voice was soft and polite. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Would you mind bringing the package inside?" I'm too weak to carry it myself. I didn't hesitate. She seemed harmless, just old and frail. I grabbed the package, a simple and marked cardboard box, and followed her inside. The mansion's interior wasn't much better than its outside, dim, musty, filled with dusty old furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. It smelled like time had forgotten this place. She led me to a small room, lit only by a few flickering candles. There was a large, ornate mirror dominating one wall. "Just leave it here," she said, pointing to the table in front of the mirror. I put the box down, but something wasn't right. I glanced at the mirror and froze. The reflection wasn't showing the same room. Why I was in it was showing a decayed, older version of the room. The walls in the reflection were crumbling, and thick cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It was like looking into the future, or maybe the past. I turned to ask the woman about it, but she was gone. The door behind me had somehow shut itself, and I could feel the air in the room grow colder. Panic started to set in. I knocked on the door. No response. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, like someone muttering in the dark, but they grew louder and more insistent. I turned back to the mirror, and what I saw made my heart stop. The decayed room in the reflection was warping. Shadows were moving, twisting into figures that looked like they were watching me, waiting. I felt trapped. The door wouldn't budge, and my phone had no signal. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, and the candles were flickering as if they could blow out any second. My breath quickened, and I realized I wasn't alone. There was something in there with me. In desperation, I opened the box I delivered. It felt heavy, but when I lifted the lid, there was nothing inside except an old-fashioned key and a note. The note read, "Thank you for your service. You may stay as long as you wish." I've lived in this old house for about 6 months. When I first moved in, it was perfect, a quiet escape in the countryside, far from the noise and stress of city life. But recently, things have started to change. It began with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, those usual creaks and groans that come with an old building. But these were different. They were soft, subtle at first, almost like whispers, like a conversation happening just out of reach. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the quiet. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were voices. I could never quite make out what they were saying, but I had the distinct feeling they were talking about me. They'd start when I was alone or at night, creepy, and when I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. It felt like the house itself was watching me. One night I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had become unbearable, filling every corner of the house. I yelled for them to stop, but it only made them louder, more frantic. In a fit of desperation, I started tearing through the house, trying to find the source of the voices. I ripped down wallpaper, tore up floorboards, and smashed through walls. But there was nothing, no wires, no speakers, no logical explanation for the whispers. That's when I noticed the carvings. Behind the layers of plaster and wallpaper were old wooden boards, darkened with age. But what caught my attention were the symbols. Tiny, intricate carvings covered every inch of the wood, twisting, curling symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of them, when I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their place. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled into the hallway. But as I looked around, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The carvings weren't just in the walls. They were everywhere, the floors, the ceilings, even the furniture. Symbols etched into every surface of the house, woven together like a nightmarish tapestry. Panic surged through me. I ran to the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. Though the locks were open, the door felt like it was sealed shut. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the house. Then I heard it, a single voice, clear as day, right behind me, "Don't leave." "We're not finished yet." I turned, but there was no one there. The voice was calm, but there was something dark and malicious in its tone. I stumbled back into the living room, searching for something, anything that could help me. But when I entered the room, I froze. The symbols on the walls had changed. They were no longer random etchings. They formed a word repeated over and over across every surface. Stay. My blood ran cold. I backed away, tripping over the torn-up floorboards, and fell to the ground. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. They weren't just whispering anymore, they were shouting, screaming at me to stay, to join them. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the stairs. If I couldn't get out, maybe I could hide. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The upstairs hallway was completely dark, an impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow everything. The whispers were there too, but they were different, softer, almost pleading. Despite the fear gripping my heart, something compelled me forward. With each step, the whispers grew louder, guiding me to the end of the hall. There was a door there, one I had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. The whispers urged me on, promising answers, promising an end to the nightmare. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single mirror on the far wall. It was large and ornate, its glass cloudy with age. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. My reflection wasn't my own. The figure in the mirror was gaunt, its face hollow and sunken. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and its eyes empty. Black voids seemed to stare into my soul. But the worst part was the smile. It was too wide, too sharp, as if it was ready to devour me. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low growl. The reflection's smile stretched even further, and it began to move toward me, its bony fingers pressing against the inside of the glass. I tried to move, to run, but I was frozen in place. The reflection reached out, its fingers stretching toward me, as if trying to break free from the mirror. No, I whispered, backing away. This can't be real. But the reflection only laughed, a hollow, distorted sound that echoed in my head. It leaned closer, its breath fogging up the glass. You can't leave, it hissed. This is your home now. I stumbled backward, hitting the floor hard. The wind knocked out of me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection was still there, its twisted smile the last thing I saw before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. The house was quiet, the whispers gone. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the carvings on the walls, the words stay etched into every surface. And, from the darkness, I heard the voice again. Welcome home. I never left that house. I couldn't. It wouldn't let me. The doors remained locked, the windows sealed. The whispers were my only company now, growing louder with each passing day. Some say houses have memories, that they hold on to the echoes of those who lived there. But this house, it doesn't just remember. It keeps you, and it has me. It was last week when I agreed to meet up with Jorge at midnight. We hadn't seen each other much since high school, so we thought it'd be fun to do something spontaneous. The idea of hanging out in the park at night seemed adventurous, like old times, when we'd just catch up and unwind. The park had always felt like a safe, familiar place until that night. When we arrived, something felt off immediately. The lights that normally lit the pathways were out, and the large map at the entrance was missing. We brushed it off, figuring it was just a power outage. The air was crisp, and the park was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. We began walking down the main path, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. It wasn't long before we noticed something strange. Clothes everywhere. A gray long-sleeved shirt was draped over a bush. A pair of jeans hung from a branch, and a red jacket flapped gently in the wind. We exchanged uneasy glances, but kept walking, assuming there had to be some explanation. As we ventured deeper into the park, we saw more shoes, hats, scarves scattered in odd places, as if someone had dropped them in a hurry. A creeping sense of dread started to settle in, but we decided to press on. We had come this far. That's when I saw a figure standing in the marshy area, near the water, just beyond the trail. It was faint, barely visible in the moonlight, but its proportions weren't quite right. Its limbs seemed too long, its posture unnatural. My heart jumped into my throat. I looked again, and it was gone. Jorge noticed my expression. "Did you see that?" He whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. We should turn back. As we started back the way we came, Jorge stopped abruptly. "I lost my phone," he said, his voice filled with anxiety. We checked our pockets, but it was gone. The thought of retracing our steps through the park was terrifying. The only other way was through the marsh, where I had seen the thing. We pressed on, walking faster now, desperate to find the exit, but something strange happened. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. We should have reached the entrance by now, but the path just kept going, winding through the trees in endless loops. "This park isn't that big," I muttered, panic rising in my chest. "We should have been out of here by now." That's when I heard footsteps behind us. They were faint but unmistakable, echoing our own steps. I glanced at Jorge. "Stop walking," I mouthed. He froze, and in that moment, something brushed against me, something cold and fragile, like a bundle of sticks. I jumped back, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. George's eyes were wide, his face pale. "We need to leave." "Nah." We started running, the footsteps growing louder behind us. No matter how fast we ran, the park seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The trees twisted and loomed overhead, casting shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. My hoodie gone. Somehow it had vanished from my body without me noticing. Then we saw it. Standing in the middle of the path was a scarecrow-like figure, wearing my hoodie. It didn't move, but the sight of it sent a cold wave of terror through me. I grabbed George's arm, and we sprinted in the opposite direction, deeper into the park. We ran for what felt like hours, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The fear of whatever was following us pushed us to keep going, but the park was a maze. We were completely lost. Finally, we spotted a tall fence in the distance, barbed wire coiled at the top. It was our only way out. "Jorge, we have to climb over," I shouted. He boosted me up, and I grabbed the top of the fence, ready to swing over. But as Jorge reached for my hand, something grabbed him, something that looked like a branch, but moved like a hand. It yanked him back into the darkness, and I heard him scream, a blood-curdling sound that still haunts me. I fell to the other side of the fence, bruised and bleeding, but I didn't stop running. I sprinted through the streets, desperate for help. When I finally returned with others, the park was empty. The clothes were gone, the scarecrow had vanished, and Jorge. Jorge was nowhere to be found. The police didn't believe me. They said I was crazy, that I must have hurt him. They couldn't explain the strange things I saw, and no one believed my story. Now I sit here in a psychiatric ward, writing down everything that happened. I don't know if it was real or not, but I do know one thing. Something in that park wasn't right, and it still has Jorge. There's something crawling inside my head, somewhere behind my eyes. It's burrowing deeper, inch by inch, heading straight for my brainstem. That's where it wants to go, and I know when it reaches that part of me, it'll take control. But I have to keep fighting, even though every second feels like ice picks are drilling through my skull. It's hard to think, hard to focus, but I have to get this out. I need to start from the beginning, so you'll understand. It all began 3 months ago. May, I think. The sky was dark and heavy, the kind of gray that feels like it's pressing down on you. Rain lashed at my face, blurring my vision, turning the ground into a misty haze where nothing was clear. I was standing outside a building, an ugly thing made of cold, brutal concrete. In front of it, beyond a line of barbed wire, there was a man holding a black umbrella. He wore a sharp, dark suit, and the only color I could see was the glint of a ruby red ring on his finger. I didn't want to be there, but I needed the money. They'd found me in a homeless shelter, surrounded by coughing, half-dead people, and the dicks lost in their own world. A man in a suit handed me a letter and for $100, asking me to meet him. I had no other choice. I shook the man's hand when I arrived. He didn't flinch or pull away, which struck me as odd. Most people looked at me with disgust. The money was for your appearance, Mr. Taylor, he said coldly. But I hadn't spent a dime on my looks. I bought food and sent what I could to my daughter. I didn't care about appearances anymore. They took me through security. The guards searched me like they expected, to find something hidden in every inch of my body. One of them even tried to take off my wedding ring, and I punched him in the jaw. They pinned me to the ground, but the man with the ring told them to back off and let me through. The room they led me to was sterile, cold. Everything was steel. Steel chairs, steel table, a single dim light overhead. It felt more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting room. They started asking me about my past, about the things I did during my time in the service. The missions, the intelligence gathering, the recruiting. They were digging into the darkest parts of my life. But I knew where this was headed. Then they asked why it ended. It all came down to that one mission. We were after a trafficker, someone dealing cesium for dirty bombs. A night raid on a shipping container. But instead of explosives, we found children. We were captured, tortured. Most of my team was killed. They kept me alive, forced me to do unspeakable things, made me watch horrors that I still can't shake. By the time rescue came, I wasn't even a man anymore. I was just a shell, already dead in every way that mattered. I was discharged after that. No benefits. No support, just thrown away like garbage. But I couldn't lose it again. Not there. Not in front of them. They told me they needed to run some tests. Fine. I'd been through worse. They strapped me in, hooked up a polygraph machine, placed sensors on my skin, a strap around my abdomen to monitor my breathing. The tester in charge sat across from me. He held up his left hand, showing me his ring, the ruby red one, with a strange blue-etched pentagram in the center. We're going to start now, he said, his voice flat. You'll follow instructions. Every time I say Ezekiel, you will repeat Ezekiel. When I say speak, you will remain silent. Do not react to the light. Do you understand? I nodded, even though I didn't get what any of this was about. He snapped at me, demanding I focus on the ring, not him. Then it began. Tester, you're at a farmer's market. It's hot. You're looking at jars of homemade jam. You overhear an old woman asking the vendor about the difference between boysenberry and blackberry. Ezekiel, me. Ezekiel, the light flashed, blinding. It felt like needles piercing my brain. Tester, you're waiting in line at a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday. The person in front of you fumbles with change, holding up the line. There's an umbrella leaning by the door. A businessman rushes in, soaked to the bone. Ezekiel, me. Ezekiel, another flash. My vision swam. Everything felt disjointed, wrong. Tester, You're driving at night. There's a car wreck, a woman is bleeding, holding out a baby, begging you to take him to the hospital. You've just bought a new suit and don't want to get blood on it. Ezekiel, me, Ezek. Ezekiel, what was happening to me? Why did I say that? My mind was screaming, but I couldn't stop. Tester. A man at a grocery store is begging for help. His card is declined. He's with his wife and baby. The total is $12. You laugh at him, Ezekiel. I stayed silent. I couldn't even think straight. Tester. Ezekiel. Still, I stayed quiet. Another flash. It was like my mind was slipping through my fingers. Tester. A holy man is dying of thirst in the desert. He has sacrificed everything for others. He begs you for water. Ezekiel. Me. I'd piss on his face. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. What the hell was happening to me? I hadn't meant to say that I couldn't have the lights snapped on. And the test was over. They unstrapped me and dragged me out of the room. My head was still spinning. The man with the ruby ring met me outside, smiling. Your test went well, he said, grinning. We'd like to offer you a position, full benefits, healthcare, dental. Starting tomorrow. No, I whimpered, I don't want this. I just want to leave. But there was no leaving. He placed a contract in front of me, his ring catching the light, and something in me snapped. My body moved on its own, signing the contract. I wasn't in control anymore. From that moment. They owned me. They put something inside me, something dark and ancient. It took control, made me do things. Horrible things. I killed people. I devoured them. Every memory came in waves, a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I tried to kill myself. I cut my wrists, took pills, even put a gun to my head, but nothing worked. Every time I woke up, it was like they were taunting me. Not letting you go, they scrawled on the walls. Now, it's burrowing deeper. Whatever they put in me is taking full control. I can feel it, but I won't fight it anymore. I died a long time ago. This thing can have my body. Let it come when it finally reveals itself. Know this. It was never me. We couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My mind reeled as I tried to piece it together, but the sight of the tadpoles in the toilet was like a hammer to my already crumbling sanity. I backed away, holding on to the door frame for support. Marie, we need to leave. Now. She shook her head, retching again into the toilet, her hands trembling as she gripped the porcelain. I don't feel right, Josh. I feel like something's inside me. The words sent a cold wave of fear washing over me. I could hear the storm outside picking up, rain pelting against the house. It was almost as if the weather itself had taken a sinister turn, matching the horror we were now trapped in. I grabbed Marie's arm, pulling her away from the toilet, my heart racing. We need to get to a hospital. This this thing isn't normal, Marie. Marie looked at me, her face pale and drained. But she nodded weakly, leaning on me as we hurried out of the bathroom and towards the front door. Every step we took felt like we were one step closer to something worse, something lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. As we neared the door, the night outside was alive with the sound of frogs croaking, a chorus of them, their rivets echoing in the darkness like a twisted symphony. I froze in place, realizing that the deep, rumbling croaks were far too loud for ordinary frogs. I glanced at Marie, fear flashing across her face. She gripped my arm tighter. Just as I reached for the door, there was a loud thump on the porch, followed by a scraping sound. My blood turned to ice as the door slowly creaked open, revealing the towering silhouette of the creature, the frog. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more frogs, all grotesquely swollen, Their skin stretched tight over their enormous bodies, smirked at us with their wide, toothy grins. "Josh," Marie whispered, her voice shaking, "what do we do?" My mind raced, but there was no plan, no strategy for handling giant, bloodthirsty frogs that shouldn't even exist. I tried to remember the last normal thing I had done before all this started. The last time everything made sense, the frogs, they watched us, seemingly waiting for something. But for what and why, I didn't have time to find out. I grabbed Marie by the arm and bolted for the back door, adrenaline surging through me as I heard the sickening sounds of the frogs following. Their wet, slapping limbs smacked against the hardwood floors, leaving behind a slick trail of slime. We burst out into the backyard, the cool rain pelting down on us. The croaking was louder now, surrounding us. I saw dark shapes moving through the grass, too many to count. "Head to the car," I shouted, practically dragging Marie along. My arm throbbed from where the creature had bitten me, but I pushed the pain aside. We had to get out of here, but before we could reach the car, the ground beneath us started to tremble. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw that the earth was moving. The wet soil began to heave and buckle, as if something massive was rising from below. I stopped dead in my tracks, horror filling my chest as the ground split open and a gargantuan, bloated frog clawed its way out of the earth. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, yellow and unblinking, locking on to us with an intelligence I didn't want to understand. This thing was their king, the leader of whatever nightmare Tyler had unleashed. Marie let out a scream as the creature opened its wide mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth that no frog should ever have. The air was thick with the stench of decay and rain, and I knew in that moment we were out of time. Without thinking, I grabbed the keys from my pocket and hurled them at Marie. "Get in the car. Go." She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "What about you? Just go," I shouted, trying to distract the monstrous frog. "I'll hold them off." I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I couldn't let Marie get swallowed by whatever horror this was. Not her. Not after everything. She nodded, her sobs lost in the rain, and sprinted towards the car. The Frog King let out a deep, resonant croak that shook the ground beneath me. I grabbed a nearby garden shovel, my hands shaking, knowing full well this wouldn't do a damn thing. But I couldn't let it win. Not without a fight. As the frog lunged at me, time seemed to slow. Its enormous body, impossibly fast for something so bloated, came hurtling towards me, its mouth wide open, ready to devour. Just as its slimy jaws closed around me, I heard the screech of tires. Marie had made it to the car. That was my last thought before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the street, rain pouring down around me. The car was gone, and so was the Frog King. I sat up, dazed, my arms still throbbing. My surroundings were eerily quiet, no croaking, no movement. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaky. The bite on my arm pulsed with a strange sensation, and I looked down to see something horrifying. My skin was turning a pale yellow-brown. Just like the frogs. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. My dad was my hero. I know it sounds like a cliche, but he really was everything to me. I need you to understand this because, if you don't, everything I've done since he disappeared will sound like madness. He was an anthropologist, and you could tell from the moment you met him. He loved people. It was in the way he smiled, the way he laughed, and how he made everyone feel like they were the center of the world. My dad was one of those people who made connections everywhere he went, whether it was the barista at the coffee shop or the bank teller. People loved him, and that love was mutual. He wrote a lot about people, too. His books sold well, especially one on folk legends in our home state of Colorado. After that book's success, he bought us a vacation home in a small Welsh town called Arfordir, right by the sea. The town had an island not far from the shore called Morgan's Isle. I didn't know it at the time, but that place would change my life forever. Summers there were incredible. My dad, always curious, took a particular interest into things about the island. At night you could hear what sounded like music, a haunting, sad melody that drifted in with the fog. He believed it was the wind playing tricks, catching in the cracks of Morgan's Isle. The second thing was the lights. If you watched the sea carefully on a clear night, you'd see tiny, shimmering lights bobbing up and down, like jewels floating on the waves. He thought it was the moon reflecting off something out there. He found it beautiful. I did, too. I was 9 when it happened. My dad decided to go fishing alone one morning. Normally, I'd go with him, but not that day. He said I had to stay behind. I didn't understand why then, but now I think he knew something. As night fell, he never came back. They found the boat smashed against the cliffs a few miles down the coast. There was no sign of him. The authorities said it was an accident, just a freak accident. They searched, but nothing came up. We buried an empty casket. For 11 years the house sat untouched. We couldn't bear to go back. My mom couldn't sell it, though. And then, after all those years, I decided I needed answers. I had to go back. My mom wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care. Something inside me had to know. So I flew to Wales, checked into a little inn, and went to the house. It was in bad shape, cracked walls, overgrown garden, dust coating everything inside. It was like time had stopped. As evening fell, I looked back at the stairs, almost expecting to see him there. But the house was empty, as it had been for 11 long years. The next day I rented a boat, just like he had. I set out to fish, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about that cave in Morgan's Isle, the one you weren't supposed to go near because it was dangerous. I thought maybe they didn't check it. Maybe my dad went there. But I pushed that thought away and spent the day fishing. I didn't catch anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me toward that cave. As the sun dipped low, I anchored my boat near the island. No patrol boats, no one around. The cave was right there, just waiting for me. I climbed out of the boat, waded to the mouth of the cave, and flicked on my flashlight. The weak beam cut through the darkness, and the moment I stepped inside, I heard something moving. My breath caught in my throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. "Dad," I whispered. It was him, or at least it looked like him. Older, rougher, but it was him. My heart raced, and I stumbled forward, desperate to embrace him. But he pulled back, slipping deeper into the cave. "There's no time, Carter," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't know what to say. He motioned for me to follow, so I did. We hurried through the narrow cave, my mind spinning with questions, but he kept talking. The day I disappeared, I found something. A ritual site deep in this cave. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up 2 days ago, and I don't know why, but something is going to happen tonight. We have to stop it. It was all too much. I was trying to process it all when I tripped, scraping my hands on the cold stone floor. But when I looked up, something strange happened. My dad had stopped, too, almost like he couldn't move unless I did. I stood slowly, testing it again. I took a step, and so did he. I stopped, and he stopped. That's when it hit me. He wasn't my dad. I moved the flashlight up, shining it directly on him. He recoiled, and I saw it. His limbs were too long, his teeth too sharp. His eyes, once full of warmth, were cold and empty, like a mannequin's. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. I ran. Behind me I could hear him, and worse, I could hear others. They were scrambling, crawling out of the cave, chasing me. I don't remember how, but I made it to the boat, threw myself inside, and gunned the motor. I didn't look back. I spent the rest of the night researching. That's when I found out what Morgan's Owl really was. The name wasn't just after some person. A Morgan is a creature in Welsh folklore, something like a siren. It lures people in, promising beauty or something they've lost, only to drown them or worse. I think that's what happened to my dad. I think he went into that cave and never came out. Now I'm sitting here on the back porch of the old house. Tomorrow I'll be on a flight home, but I couldn't leave without looking out at the sea one last time. The melody is there again, clearer than I remember, and the lights, those flickering lights, are drifting on the waves. My dad was wrong. They aren't beautiful. They're dead, hollow, like glass eyes in a doll staring back at me.